I sold myself for survival and discovered I'd bought an empire. That's what they whispered in town when Clara Whitmore married the poorest cowboy in the territory to save her dying father. 22 years old, 2 weeks from losing everything, she made a choice that looked like desperation. But sometimes the greatest fortunes hide behind the roughest exteriors, and the most powerful partnerships begin with a handshake instead of a kiss. This is the story of how a mountain girl with nothing became the woman who couldn't be bought, because she'd already claimed her own worth. If you're ready for a journey from foreclosure to fortune, from desperation to dynasty, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The first sound Clara Whitmore heard that morning was her father coughing. Not the gentle clearing of a throat or the brief hack of someone catching their breath. This was the deep, rattling sound of lungs struggling against fluid and infection. The kind of cough that shook the thin walls of their mountain cabin and sent frost dust falling from the rafters like grim snow. She was already awake. She'd been awake for hours, lying in the narrow bed she'd slept in since childhood, staring at the ceiling beams her father had hewn with his own hands 20 years ago when hope still lived in this valley. The wood was good Douglas fir, straight-grained and strong, but even the best timber couldn't hold up a life that was collapsing from within. Clara threw back the worn quilt, her grandmother's handiwork, now patched so many times the original pattern was barely visible, and swung her feet onto the cold plank floor. February in the Colorado high country didn't forgive bare feet, but they'd run out of firewood 3 days ago, and she wasn't about to burn the furniture. Not yet. They still had 12 days before the bank came. 12 days to find $473. She dressed quickly in the dim pre-dawn light, 2 pairs of wool socks with holes in the toes, a flannel dress that had been her mother's before consumption took her 4 winters back, a sweater she'd knitted herself from unraveled yarn, and over it all, her father's old canvas coat that hung to her knees and smelled of wood smoke in better times. Thomas Whitmore was sitting up in bed when she entered his room, his face gray as old snow in the weak light filtering through the oiled paper window. He was 48 years old and looked 70. 6 months of illness had carved him down to bone and sinew, and the fever that came and went left him weak as a newborn calf. "You should be sleeping," Clara said, keeping her voice steady even as her heart cracked at the sight of him. "Hard to sleep when you can't breathe," he said, managing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, I wanted to catch you before you headed out." Clara busied herself with the water pitcher, grateful for something to do with her hands. "I'm just going to check the fence line on the lower 40. Won't be gone more than a few hours." It was a lie, and they both knew it. She was going into town to beg. Again. "Clara." His voice was soft but firm, the voice that had taught her to read and cipher and think for herself, even when the schoolmistress said education was wasted on mountain girls. "Come here." She sat on the edge of his bed, and he took her hand. His palm was hot with fever, his fingers thin as kindling. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about the Henderson place." Clara's stomach tightened. The Henderson place had been foreclosed on 6 weeks ago. The family had packed what they could carry into a wagon and headed east toward the Kansas plains, leaving behind a homestead 3 generations had built. The bank sold it for pennies on the dollar to a mining company that wanted the water rights. "Don't," she said quietly. "It's going to happen to us, Clara. You know it. I know it. We can't pay what we owe, and the bank won't wait forever." He paused to breathe, each inhale a visible effort. "I want you to think about yourself. You're 22 years old. You should be married, with a home of your own, not trying to save a dying man and a dead farm." "This isn't a dead farm," Clara said, but the words felt hollow even to her. The truth was, the land was played out. Her father had been a logger before an accident crushed his leg 15 years ago, and he'd turned to farming because it was all he could do. But this high valley soil was thin and rocky, good for grazing, but not much else, and they didn't have enough cleared acreage or livestock to make a real go of it. They'd survived on her father's reputation. He'd been one of the best timbermen in the territory before his injury, known for his skill with an axe and his honest dealings. People had helped them out of respect and memory, but respect didn't pay debts, and memory faded when times got hard for everyone. "I want you to promise me something," Thomas said, squeezing her hand. "When I'm gone—" "You're not going anywhere," Clara interrupted, but he talked over her. When I'm gone, don't try to hold on to this place out of sentiment. Take whatever you can get for it and start over somewhere fresh. You're smart, Clara. Smarter than I ever was. You can read and write and figure numbers better than half the men in this county. You could be a school teacher or a bookkeeper or— I'm not leaving you, Clara said firmly. And I'm not giving up, not with 12 days left. She stood before he could argue further, kissed his burning forehead, and left the room before the tears she'd been holding back could fall where he could see them. The kitchen was as cold as a root cellar. Clara wrapped a scarf around her neck and head, pulled on her mittens, more holes than wool at this point, and stepped out into a world rendered brutal by winter. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night, leaving everything buried under a fresh 8 inches of white that sparkled in the weak morning sun. The sky was that hard, bright blue that meant more cold coming, and the wind off the high peaks cut through her layers like 1,000 small knives. Their cabin sat in a narrow valley hemmed in by steep, timbered slopes. It was beautiful country in a harsh, unforgiving way, the kind of place that could kill you if you made one wrong choice or got caught in one bad storm. Clara had been born here, raised here, and she'd expected to die here someday, old and surrounded by children and grandchildren. But life didn't care about expectations. She made her way to the small barn, more of a shed, really, where their 2 remaining animals lived. They'd had 6 chickens, 2 pigs, and a milk cow at the start of winter. Now they were down to the cow, who was too old to give much milk, and her father's horse, a 15-year-old gelding named Buck, who'd been a good working animal in his prime, but now moved like his joints pained him. She fed them the last of the hay she'd been rationing and tried not to think about what would happen when it ran out. The cow would probably have to be slaughtered. Buck. She couldn't think about Buck. "I'll find a way," she whispered to the old horse as he lipped grain from her palm, his breath warm on her frozen fingers. "I promise." Another lie. The walk into town was 5 miles down a road that was more ice than dirt this time of year. Clara had made the journey so many times she could probably do it blindfolded, past the Turner farm where smoke rose from the chimney in a warm promise of life continuing, past the old sawmill that had been shut down since the big timber companies moved operations further west, past the creek that would be running wild with snowmelt in another 2 months, but now lay frozen and silent under white drifts. Timber Falls was a town of maybe 300 souls, clinging to existence in the shadow of the mountains. It had been bigger once, back when the logging was good and the railroad spur brought supplies and took out timber. But the big trees were mostly gone from the accessible valleys now, and the railroad had stopped running 5 years back when the company went bankrupt. What remained was a scattering of buildings along a single main street: the general store, the bank, the saloon, the church, the feed and grain, and a handful of houses where the more prosperous families lived. Everything was built of timber, naturally, and everything was weathered gray by altitude and time. Clara's destination was the bank, a squat building that took itself far too seriously with its painted sign and barred windows. She'd been here 4 times in the last month, and each visit had been a fresh humiliation. The first time she'd come with hope, explaining the situation and asking for an extension. Mr. Winters, the bank manager, had been sympathetic but firm. The note was due. No extensions. The second time, she'd come with anger, demanding to know why the bank couldn't show mercy to a family that had been part of this community for 2 generations. Mr. Winters had been less sympathetic. Business was business. The third time, she'd come with desperation, offering to sign over deed to the property immediately if they'd just give her father time to recover, time to find work, time to make things right. Mr. Winters had been cold. The property was worth less than the debt. Time wouldn't change that. The fourth time, she'd come with numbers, a carefully worked out plan showing how she could pay back the debt over 3 years if they'd just refinance. Mr. Winters hadn't even looked at her figures. The decision was made. Foreclosure proceedings would begin March 1st. Today was February 16th. She was coming with nothing but pride, and pride wasn't legal tender. The bank's door was locked when she arrived. Too early. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, stamping her feet against the cold, watching her breath frost in the air, and trying to figure out what she was going to say that she hadn't already said. Please, mercy, justice, time. None of those words had worked before. Why would they work now? You waiting for Winters? Clara turned to find old Mrs. Chen sweeping snow off the sidewalk in front of her laundry. Mrs. Chen had come west from San Francisco 30 years ago following the railroad construction, and she'd stayed when her husband died because, as she'd once told Clara, "I like mountains better than people, and these mountains don't care where you came from." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. Mrs. Chen stopped sweeping and leaned on her broom, studying Clara with eyes that missed nothing. "He's not going to help you." "I know." "Then why are you here?" Clara was silent for a moment, then, "Because I don't know what else to do." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "That's honest, at least." She paused. "You know what I did when my husband died and left me with debts and no way to pay them?" "What?" "I made a deal with the devil." Mrs. Chen's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. Or at least that's what the church ladies called it. "I borrowed money from a man everyone said was dangerous, at terms everyone said were robbery, and I paid him back every penny with interest over 10 years of washing other people's clothes until my hands bled. And you know what?" "What?" "I'm still here. Still got my business. Still got my dignity." She started sweeping again. Sometimes the devil's deal is the only deal that keeps you alive long enough to make a better one. Clara was still thinking about that when the bank door opened 20 minutes later and Mr. Winters arrived, looking surprised and not particularly pleased to see her. "Miss Whitmore," he said without warmth, "I thought we'd concluded our business." "I'd like to speak with you," Clara said, hating how small her voice sounded. Winters sighed the sigh of a busy man being inconvenienced. "5 minutes. In my office." The bank's interior was warmer than outside, but not by much. Winters believed in economy in all things. His office was a cramped space barely big enough for a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. He sat behind the desk without offering Clara a seat. "What can I do for you, Miss Whitmore?" His tone suggested he could do nothing, and they both knew it. Clara remained standing. She'd learned that much at least. Never sit when you're begging. It makes you too easy to dismiss. "I came to ask if there's been any change in the bank's position regarding our property." "There has not." "I see." Clara swallowed. "And if I were to find additional collateral—" "You don't have additional collateral, Miss Whitmore. We've been through this." Winters pulled out a pocket watch and made a show of checking it. "Your father's land is worth approximately $200 in current market conditions. You owe $473. The equity doesn't exist. But if the land were properly developed, it won't be. Not by your father. Not in his condition." Winters said it flatly, without cruelty, but without kindness either. Just fact. "I'm sorry, but this is a business decision, not a personal one." "It's personal to me," Clara said quietly. "Of course it is. But the bank can't operate on sentiment." He stood, clearly ending the meeting. "The foreclosure notice stands. You have until March 1st to vacate. I suggest you use the time to make arrangements." Clara didn't move. "Mr. Winters, my father is dying." "I know. I'm sorry for that. Truly." And he did look sorry, in a distant, theoretical way. But his medical condition doesn't change the financial reality. Turning us out will kill him faster. That's not the bank's responsibility. Something cold and hard settled in Clara's chest. "No, I suppose it isn't." She left without another word, walking back out into the bright cold morning with nothing to show for her trip except confirmation that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. The saloon was open. It was always open. And for one wild moment, Clara considered walking in and drinking until the world stopped making sense. But she had $5 in her pocket, the last $5 in the world to her name, and whiskey wouldn't save her father. She was halfway down the main street, heading toward home with nothing accomplished and nowhere else to turn, when she heard the horse. Not unusual in a mountain town. Horses were everywhere. But something about this one made her look up. Maybe the steady, unhurried sound of its hooves in the snow. Maybe some instinct she didn't know she possessed. The rider came around the bend from the north road, and Clara stopped walking. He was tall in the saddle, dressed in worn canvas and leather that had seen hard use, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. His horse was a big sorrel gelding, well-muscled and well-cared for, the kind of animal that cost real money. But the man himself looked like a dozen other cowboys she'd seen drifting through the territory. rough, weathered, unremarkable. He rode past her without a glance, tied his horse to the rail in front of the general store, and went inside. Clara dismissed him from her mind and kept walking. She made it another block before Mrs. Chen's words came back to her. Sometimes the devil's deal is the only deal that keeps you alive long enough to make a better one. She stopped, turned around, walked back to the general store. The cowboy was at the counter buying supplies, coffee, beans, flour, salt pork, the kind of order that suggested a man provisioning for weeks in the backcountry. He paid in cash, counting out bills from a worn leather wallet, and Clara's desperate mind immediately calculated, at least $50, maybe more. When he finished his transaction and headed for the door, Clara stepped into his path. "Excuse me," she said. He stopped, and for the first time she saw his face clearly. He was older than she'd thought, maybe 35, maybe 40, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of slate. Not handsome exactly, but strong-featured and clean-shaven. He looked at her with the patient wariness of a man who'd learned to be careful around strangers. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim. Clara's heart hammered. This was insane. She didn't know this man. Didn't know anything about him except that he had cash and a good horse and the look of someone who didn't need to beg for anything. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began and heard her voice shake. "But I'm in a difficult situation, and I wonder if you might be willing to hear me out." His expression didn't change. "I'm listening." And right there, in the middle of the general store with Mr. Patterson pretending not to eavesdrop and two other customers definitely eavesdropping, Clara Whitmore did something she would never have imagined herself doing. She offered herself for sale. Not in those words, of course. She wasn't crude. But she laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Her father dying, the debt, the foreclosure, the absolute absence of any other options. And then, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her, she made her proposal. "I'm educated. I can read, write, and manage numbers. I can cook, clean, and manage a household. I'm healthy and strong, and I'm not afraid of work." She met his eyes. "If you're a man in need of a wife, and if you have $473, I'm willing to discuss terms." The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Patterson dropped a can of peaches. The cowboy's expression remained utterly neutral. "You're proposing marriage," he said finally. "To a stranger." "Yes." "For money." "To save my father's life and our home." "Yes." He studied her for a long moment. "What's your name?" "Clara Whitmore." "I'm Silas Boone." He said it quietly, as if the name might mean something to her. It didn't. "Mr. Boone, I understand this is unusual." "It's insane," he said, but not unkindly. "Yes," Clara agreed, "but I'm out of options, and you look like a man who might understand desperate measures." Something flickered in those slate eyes. "I might." "Then will you at least consider it?" Silas Boone looked at her, really looked, the kind of assessment a man makes when buying livestock or hiring a hand. Clara stood still and let him look. She had nothing left to hide behind. "I'll need to ask you some questions," he said finally. "All right." "Not here." He glanced at their audience. "You know the old sawmill?" "Yes." "Meet me there in 1 hour. Come alone." He left before she could respond, collecting his supplies and walking out into the cold without looking back. Clara stood in the sudden quiet of the store, aware of every eye on her, and wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or perhaps the only choice that mattered. The hour crawled past like a wounded animal. Clara walked home and told her father she was going to check the fence line. Another lie. She was getting good at those. She changed into her better dress, not that it was much better, but it didn't have patches at the elbows, and braided her hair with hands that trembled. In the small mirror over the washstand, she examined herself critically. Brown hair, brown eyes, a face that was pleasant enough but nothing special. Too thin from worry and short rations, hands roughened by work. She looked exactly like what she was. A mountain girl with more backbone than beauty, worn down by circumstances but not broken. Not yet. The old sawmill sat on the creek about a mile from town, abandoned since the timber companies moved on. It was a skeleton of a building now, just framework and shadows, but it was shelter from the wind and private. Silas Boone was already there when she arrived, standing beside his horse and smoking a cigarette. He crushed it out when he saw her approach. "You came," he said. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might come to your senses." He gestured to a fallen log. "Sit, please." Clara sat. Silas remained standing, and she had the sense he was giving her the advantage of not having to look up at him. It was a small courtesy, but she noted it. "I'm going to ask you questions," he said. "I need you to answer honestly. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Why are you really doing this?" Clara had expected the question, but hadn't expected it first, hadn't expected him to cut straight to the bone. "Because my father is dying and we're about to lose everything, and I'm tired of being helpless. Because I need money and I have nothing to sell except myself. Because I'm practical enough to know that marriage is an economic arrangement as much as anything else. And at least this way I'm negotiating my own terms." Silas nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Are you hoping I'll fall in love with you?" The bluntness of it startled her. "No." "Good, because I won't." He said it without heat or apology. "I'm not a romantic man, Miss Whitmore. If we do this, it'll be a business arrangement, nothing more." "I understand. Do you?" He studied her. "Because most women want more than that, whether they admit it or not. Most women haven't watched their father die by inches while the bank circles like vultures," Clara said quietly. "I'm not looking for romance, Mr. Boone. I'm looking for survival." "And after your father passes? What then?" Clara had thought about this, of course. "Then I'll be a widow with property and independence. Or still your wife, if you want that. Those terms would have to be negotiated." "Negotiated," Silas repeated, and something that might have been amusement touched his face. "You're practical." "I have to be." He pulled out another cigarette, lit it, drew smoke. "Here's my situation, Miss Whitmore. I'm 38 years old. I work in timber, cutting, hauling, managing. It's hard, dangerous work in isolated country. I'm gone for weeks at a time. When I'm not gone, I'm not social. I don't drink much, don't gamble, don't run around. I've got money saved, and I've got prospects for more." He paused. "What I don't have is a wife, and at my age, that's starting to look permanent." "Why?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. "Because women want things I can't give. Pretty words. Soft living, constant attention." He shrugged. "I'm not built for that. I'm built for work." "So you want a wife who won't expect romance or softness?" I want a partner who understands the deal we're making." He looked at her directly. "I pay your father's debts, every penny. I marry you legal and proper. You come with me to where I'm working. You keep house, manage what needs managing, and don't complain about the isolation. In return, you get security. A roof, food, and when your father passes, a settlement that leaves you independent." Clara's mind raced. "What kind of settlement?" "We can work that out. I'm not looking to cheat you." "How do I know that?" "You don't." Silas said it flatly. "Just like I don't know if you'll stick around once your father's gone and you've got your independence. We're both taking a risk." Clara considered. It was insane. Marrying a stranger, moving to who knew where, tying her life to a man she'd met an hour ago. But what was the alternative? Watch her father die knowing she could have saved him? Lose the land her family had bled for? End up alone and penniless? Dependent on charity, or worse? "I have conditions," she said finally. Silas's eyebrow rose. "Go on." "I want the debt payment in writing. A bank draft, not cash. I want the marriage certificate legal and recorded. And I want a separate account in my name with at least $100 in it, so I'm not completely dependent on your goodwill. Anything else? If you're cruel or violent, the deal is off. I'm not. I'll be the judge of that." Silas smiled then, a real smile, small and brief but genuine. "You're tougher than you look, Miss Whitmore." "I have to be," Clara said again. He finished his cigarette in silence, crushing it carefully under his boot heel. "All right, here's what happens next. I go to the bank today and arrange the draft. Tomorrow morning, we go to the preacher. Day after, we head north to where I'm working. Any of that a problem?" Tomorrow morning, Clara's stomach lurched. "That's fast. Your father doesn't have time for slow, and neither do I. I need to be back at camp by the end of the week." Silas watched her. "If you're having second thoughts—" "I'm not," Clara interrupted. I need to tell my father. Tell him whatever you need to. But understand, once we do this, there's no going back. I'm not a man who divorces. Neither am I, Clara said, and meant it. They shook hands on it, there in the skeletal shadows of the old sawmill. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not crushing. A working man's hand. Clara walked home in a daze, the weight of what she'd just agreed to settling on her shoulders like a yoke. By tomorrow night, she'd be a married woman. Married to a stranger, leaving everything she'd ever known. Her father was awake when she returned, sitting by the window and looking out at the snow. "Clara," he said when she entered, "I was getting worried." She pulled a chair close to his and sat. "Papa, I need to tell you something." And she did. All of it. The proposal in the general store, the meeting at the sawmill, the terms, the timeline. Thomas Whitmore listened without interrupting, his thin face unreadable. When she finished, the silence stretched long. "Do you love him?" he asked finally. "I don't even know him." "Then why—" "Because I can save you," Clara said, and her voice broke on the words she'd been holding back. "Because I can keep the land and give you time to heal, and maybe give us both a chance at something better than dying poor in the snow." Her father reached for her hand. "Clara, I don't want you sacrificing yourself." "It's not a sacrifice," she interrupted. "It's a choice. My choice. And maybe it's not the choice you'd want for me, but it's the one I'm making." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What's he like?" "Honest, I think. Direct. He didn't try to charm me or lie to me. He laid out terms like a business contract." Clara smiled faintly. "Actually, I kind of respected that." "And you trust him?" "I don't know him well enough to trust him, but I don't have any other options worth trusting more." Thomas Whitmore looked at his daughter, his smart, stubborn, surviving daughter, and Clara saw tears on his weathered cheeks. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he whispered. "So proud of how strong you are. Or horrified that I'm marrying for money." "No." He squeezed her hand. "She'd understand. She married me when I had nothing but an axe and a strong back. Sometimes love comes later. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. But partnership, that's something you can build on." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself cry, just for a moment. Tomorrow, she'd be someone's wife. Tonight, she was still her father's daughter. The wedding happened at dawn. Silas arrived at the cabin before first light, riding his big sorrel and leading a second horse, a smaller mare, well-bred and sound. He handed Clara the reins without ceremony. "For you," he said, "if you're going to live in high country, you need to ride." It was the closest thing to a wedding gift she could have imagined, and it took her completely by surprise. Thank you." "Practical," Silas said, "not romantic." But Clara saw the way he'd chosen the mare carefully, seen the good saddle and blanket, and she thought maybe practical could be its own kind of kindness. They rode to town together in the frozen pre-dawn, Clara's father wrapped in blankets on the buckboard that Silas had somehow arranged. The preacher was waiting at the church, looking disapproving but willing. He'd been paid in advance, Clara noticed, and paid well. The ceremony took 5 minutes. No flowers, no music, no guests except her father and Mrs. Chen, who showed up uninvited and stood in the back pew like a witness to something important. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man?" Clara said yes. "Do you, Silas Boone, take this woman?" Silas said yes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." And just like that, Clara's name changed. Her future changed. Everything changed. Silas kissed her on the forehead, formal, impersonal, and they signed the certificate. Then he pulled out a bank draft from his coat and handed it to Thomas Whitmore. "This covers your debt in full," Silas said. "Take it to Winters today. I've already spoken with him. He'll honor it." Clara's father stared at the paper with shaking hands. $473, written out in ink that would save his life and his land. "I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said hoarsely. "Take care of yourself," Silas replied. "That's thanks enough." They left the church as husband and wife, Clara on her new mare and Silas on his sorrel, riding north out of town while the sun painted the mountains gold and the whole world lay buried in snow. Clara looked back once, at the cabin, at her father standing in the doorway, at everything she was leaving behind. Then she turned forward and rode into the unknown, wearing a borrowed ring and a stranger's name, carrying nothing but practical hope and the stubborn will to survive whatever came next. The town whispered, of course. Poor Clara Whitmore, married to a poor cowboy for nothing, a desperate choice. But Clara wasn't poor anymore. She was Mrs. Silas Boone, and the journey into the mountains had only just begun. The climb began almost immediately. They rode in silence through terrain that grew progressively more brutal with each mile. The main road, if it could even be called that, gave way to a narrow trail that switchbacked up the mountain face in tight, treacherous turns. On one side, the slope rose almost vertical, thick with pine and Douglas fir. On the other, nothing but air and a drop that would kill anything that fell. Clara's mare picked her way carefully over ice-slicked rocks and exposed roots. The animal was sure-footed, thank heaven, because Clara's own riding skills were rudimentary at best. She'd been on a horse maybe a dozen times in her life, always borrowed animals for short trips to town. This was different. This required trust she wasn't sure she possessed. "Keep your weight centered," Silas called back without turning. "Let her find her own footing. She knows what she's doing, even if you don't." Clara adjusted her seat, gripping the saddle horn perhaps harder than necessary. "How much further?" "We'll make camp at the high pass tonight. Another day's ride beyond that." Another day. Clara tried not to think about what that meant. She'd never been more than 10 miles from the cabin where she was born. Now she was climbing into country she'd only seen from a distance, following a man she'd known for less than 48 hours. Her husband. The word still felt foreign in her mind, like a stone she kept turning over, examining from different angles but never quite understanding. They rode for hours, the sun climbing and then beginning its descent, the temperature dropping as altitude ate whatever warmth the February day offered. Clara's fingers went numb inside her mittens. Her legs ached from gripping the saddle. Her face stung from wind that seemed determined to flay the skin from her bones. But she didn't complain. Silas had been clear about that expectation. And besides, complaining wouldn't change anything. It never did. The high pass turned out to be a narrow saddle between two peaks where stunted pines grew in twisted defiance of the wind. Silas pulled up near a cluster of large boulders that offered some shelter and dismounted in one smooth motion. "We'll stop here," he said, already loosening his saddle cinch. "There's a spring just over that rise. Ground's too frozen to picket the horses, so we'll tie them to the trees." Clara slid from her mare less gracefully, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit solid ground. Every muscle screamed. She'd been riding for 8 hours straight with only 2 brief stops to rest the horses. "You all right?" Silas asked, and she couldn't tell if it was genuine concern or just practical assessment. "Fine," she lied, reaching for her saddle. "Leave it. I'll handle the horses. You gather firewood." It wasn't a suggestion. Clara bit back a response about being perfectly capable of unsaddling her own mount and went to collect wood instead. The ground was littered with deadfall, and she was grateful for something to do that didn't involve sitting on a horse. By the time she returned with her arms full of branches, Silas had both horses rubbed down and tied, their saddles and gear stacked against the boulders. He'd also cleared a spot for a fire and arranged stones in a circle. "Good dry wood," he noted, taking the branches from her. "You know what you're doing." "I grew up in the mountains, Mr. Boone. I've built a few fires." "Silas," he corrected, striking a match. "You're my wife now. Might as well use my name." Wife. There was that word again. The fire caught quickly, flames licking at the dry wood and sending warmth into the gathering dusk. Clara stood as close as she dared, letting the heat work into her frozen hands and face. Silas pulled supplies from his saddlebags: coffee, hardtack, dried beef, a small pot. He filled the pot with snow, set it at the edge of the fire, and waited for it to melt. The whole process was efficient, practiced, the movements of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. "How long have you been working in timber?" Clara asked, more to fill the silence than from genuine curiosity. "Since I was 14. Started as a choker setter, worked my way up." He added coffee grounds to the now boiling water. Dangerous work, but it pays if you're smart about it. And you're smart about it. Smart enough to still be alive. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. Most men who start in the woods don't make it to 40. Lost too many friends to widowmakers and snapback cables. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. The coffee was strong and bitter, the kind that put heat in your belly whether you liked the taste or not. Why do you keep doing it then? Silas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Because I'm good at it. Because it's what I know, and because... He paused. Because there's something honest about timber work. You read the tree wrong, it kills you. You set the rigging wrong, it kills you. There's no lying to yourself in the woods. Either you know what you're doing or you die. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I know. They ate in silence. Hardtack softened in coffee, strips of dried beef that required serious chewing. It wasn't much, but Clara had eaten worse during the lean months. At least here there was plenty. As full dark settled, the temperature plummeted. Clara could see her breath in the firelight, could feel the cold pressing in from all sides like something alive and hungry. You should sleep, Silas said, pulling out bedrolls. We leave at first light. Clara watched as he arranged 2 separate bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. Relief and something else. Something she couldn't quite name flickered through her. I'm not expecting anything from you, Silas said, catching her look. I told you this was a business arrangement. That includes sleeping arrangements until you decide otherwise. And if I never decide otherwise? He shrugged. Then we'll have a celibate marriage. Won't be the first one in history. Clara wasn't sure whether to be grateful or insulted. She settled for grateful and crawled into the bedroll he'd indicated. The blankets were thick wool, well-made and warm. Practical, like everything else about Silas Boone. She lay staring up at stars so bright and numerous they looked like spilled salt across black cloth. The fire crackled, the horses shifted and blew. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, lonely and wild and utterly foreign to everything Clara had known. Silas? She said quietly. Yeah? Thank you for helping my father. Silence. Then, you're welcome. Clara closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept circling back to the same question. What kind of man was Silas Boone, really? What kind of man paid a stranger's debts and asked for nothing but a business arrangement in return? She didn't know, but she was beginning to suspect there was more to him than rough canvas and careful distance. Morning came cold and clear, the sun painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Clara woke stiff and sore, every muscle protesting the previous day's ride. She forced herself upright, noting that Silas was already awake, the fire rebuilt and coffee brewing. Sleep all right? He asked. Well enough. Another lie. She'd barely slept, kept awake by cold and unfamiliar sounds and the strangeness of everything. They ate quickly, more hardtack, more coffee, and were on the trail within the hour. The descent from the high pass was if anything more treacherous than the climb, the trail dropping in steep pitches that had Clara leaning back in the saddle to keep from sliding forward over her mare's neck. But the country was spectacular. Clara couldn't help staring even as fear knotted her stomach. They rode through valleys where snow lay pristine and untouched, through groves of aspen standing white as bone against dark evergreens, past frozen waterfalls that hung like crystal curtains from granite cliffs. It was beautiful and brutal and utterly empty of human presence. They saw deer, and once a small herd of elk moving through deep snow like ships cutting through water. But no people, no cabins, no smoke rising from distant chimneys, just wilderness. Does anyone live up here? Claire asked as they stopped to rest the horses. A few trappers, some prospectors who never found color and were too stubborn to leave. Silas scanned the surrounding peaks with the automatic wariness of someone who knew these mountains could kill. Mostly it's just trees and timber camps. And that's where we're going? A timber camp? Eventually. Something in his tone made Clara look at him sharply. What does that mean? Silas met her gaze. It means we need to talk before we get there. About what you're going to see. Clara's stomach tightened. All right. He dismounted and Clara followed. They stood in a small clearing where the sun broke through the canopy and scattered shafts of light. I wasn't completely honest with you. Silas began, and Clara's heart sank. Here it came. The revelation that this was all some elaborate trick, that he was actually broke or wanted or dangerous. I told you I work in timber, that's true. What I didn't tell you is that I don't just work for timber operations. I own one. Clara stared. What? A large one. Multiple crews, multiple sites, contracts with railroads and mining companies across 3 territories. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. I'm not a poor cowboy, Clara. I'm a wealthy man. The world tilted slightly. Then why did you let me think? Because I wanted to know if you'd marry me anyway. Silas's slate eyes were steady on hers. I've had women chase me before when they found out about the money. Sweet-talking, batting eyelashes, playing games. I wanted a wife who'd choose me without being blinded by wealth. Someone practical, someone honest. Clara's mind reeled. So this was, what? A test? A filter? He pulled off his gloves, revealing hands that were indeed calloused from work but also bore a gold ring she hadn't noticed before. Heavy. Expensive. I didn't lie to you. I do work timber. I do live rough when I'm at the camps. Everything I told you was true. I just didn't tell you all of it. That's splitting hairs. Maybe. He watched her carefully. Are you angry? Clara thought about it. Was she? He had withheld information, certainly, let her make assumptions. But he'd also paid her father's debts without hesitation, married her without demanding anything in return, and treated her with more respect in 2 days than most men showed their wives in a lifetime. I'm not angry, she said slowly. I'm confused. If you're wealthy, why live like this? Why not marry someone from Denver or San Francisco? Someone educated and refined? Because educated and refined women don't want to live in timber camps 6 months of the year. They want ballrooms and opera houses and servants. Silas paused. I tried that once. It didn't take. You were married before? Engaged. She lasted exactly 1 visit to the operation before deciding she'd rather marry a banker. He said it without bitterness, just fact. Turned out we both wanted different things. She wanted society. I wanted someone who could handle the isolation and understand the work. So you went looking for a mountain girl who needed money badly enough to be practical. I went looking for a partner who wouldn't quit when things got hard. Silas picked up his reins. There's a difference. Clara mounted her mare, her thoughts churning. The revelation changed everything and nothing. She was still married to a stranger, still leaving behind everything familiar, still making a calculated choice for survival. But now that choice included something she hadn't expected, actual security, real wealth, a future that didn't involve scraping by on the edge of poverty. This place we're going, she said as they started riding again. Tell me about it. It's called Boone's Valley. My grandfather found it 40 years ago. Hidden basin, good timber, year-round water source. He started small, just him and my father logging selectively and floating timber down to the nearest railroad. When he died, my father expanded the operation. When he died, it came to me. No siblings? A sister. She married a lawyer and moved to Chicago. Didn't want anything to do with the timber business. And an uncle, apparently, Clara said, remembering something Silas had mentioned earlier. Silas's expression darkened slightly. Victor, my father's younger brother, he manages the Denver office and the contracts. We don't always see eye to eye. The way he said it suggested considerable understatement, but Clara didn't press. She had enough to process already. They rode on. The trail began to descend into a canyon so narrow Clara could barely see sky between the walls. A creek ran through it, frozen at the edges but still flowing in the center, the sound of water over rock echoing off stone. The path followed the creek bed, winding between boulders the size of cabins, and then the canyon opened. Clara pulled up her mare so abruptly the animal tossed her head in protest. Before her lay a valley that shouldn't exist, a hidden basin perhaps 2 miles across, ringed by mountains so steep they looked like walls. The valley floor was relatively flat, covered in snow but showing the shapes of buildings beneath. Lots of buildings. Barns, storage sheds. What looked like bunkhouses. And in the center, dominating everything, a massive timber lodge. It was 3 stories tall, built from logs so large they must have required teams of horses to move. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Glass windows, real glass, not oiled paper, caught the afternoon sun. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and Clara could see carving detail in the support posts even from this distance. It wasn't a cabin. It was a mansion built from forest bones. "Welcome home," Silas said quietly. Clara couldn't speak. She'd expected a rough camp, maybe a decent cabin. Not this. Never this. They rode down into the valley, and as they got closer, Clara saw more details that made her head spin. The barns were huge, built to shelter equipment and animals through brutal winters. The bunkhouses were solid construction, with stone foundations and proper roofs. The whole operation looked permanent, established, wealthy. Workers appeared as they rode in, rough men in canvas and wool, stopping their tasks to watch. Clara counted at least 15, maybe 20, all of them staring at her. Silas raised a hand in greeting. "Back to work. Nothing to see here." They scattered, but Clara could feel their eyes tracking her. The new wife. The stranger. The woman their boss had married for reasons they couldn't begin to guess. A man emerged from the lodge as they reached it, older, maybe 60, with iron gray hair and a limp that spoke of old injury. His face lit up when he saw Silas. "About damn time you got back," he called. "Was starting to think you'd gotten lost or stupid." "Neither, Marcus. Just took care of some business in Timber Falls." Silas dismounted and clasped the older man's hand. "Marcus Reed, I want you to meet Clara, my wife." Marcus's eyes went wide. "Your what?" "Wife. Married her 2 days ago." The old man looked from Silas to Clara and back again. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." "Well, hell." Marcus stepped forward, offering Clara his hand as she dismounted. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the language and the surprise. Silas here doesn't usually do anything without planning it 6 ways to Sunday. Marriage included, apparently." Clara shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip despite his age. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Reed." "Marcus, just Marcus." He was still staring at her like she might be a hallucination. "You need to come inside. It's cold as a witch's heart out here, and you look half frozen." The interior of the lodge was as impressive as the exterior. The main room was enormous, with a ceiling that soared 2 stories high. Exposed timber beams thick as a man's body crisscrossed overhead. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, large enough to roast a whole elk. Furniture that was handmade but well-crafted filled the space. Chairs, tables, benches, all built to last. And it was warm. Blessedly, wonderfully warm. "I'll get a fire going in the upstairs bedroom," Marcus said, already moving toward a staircase. "You'll want to get settled before dinner." Silas stopped him. "I'll do it. You handle the horses." He turned to Clara. "Come on, I'll show you around." The tour was brief but thorough. Downstairs, the great room, a dining area with a table that could seat 20, a kitchen that was surprisingly well equipped, and a study filled with ledgers and maps and the business of running a timber operation. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms, each one simple but comfortable, with real beds and proper linens. Silas led her to the largest bedroom, the one that was clearly his, with clothes hanging from pegs and books stacked on a side table. "This is yours now," he said. "I'll take one of the other rooms." Clara looked around. The space was Spartan but not uncomfortable. A large bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with a real porcelain basin, a window overlooking the valley, and most surprising, a small wood stove already radiating heat. "Marcus works fast," Silas noted, seeing her look at the stove. "He's been managing this place since my grandfather's time. Knows what needs doing before anyone asks." "Silas," Clara turned to face him. I don't understand. You have all this, and you were willing to marry a stranger just for a partner," Silas interrupted. "I told you, I don't need another worker. I've got plenty of those. I need someone who can manage things when I'm in the field. Someone who can handle the books, deal with suppliers, make decisions without falling apart." He paused. "I need an equal, not a decoration." "But you don't know if I can do any of that. You negotiated terms with me when you had nothing to bargain with. You asked the right questions. You didn't let sentiment cloud your judgment." He smiled slightly. I'm betting you can handle ledgers just fine." A knock on the door interrupted them. Marcus poked his head in. "Dinner in an hour," he announced. "Clara, I took the liberty of bringing up some of Mrs. Reed's old clothes. They're in the trunk at the foot of the bed. Might fit better than what you're wearing." "Mrs. Reed?" Clara asked. "My wife. Died 3 years back." Marcus's weathered face softened. "She'd want you to have them. Lord knows no one else is using them." After he left, Clara opened the trunk and found it full of dresses, shawls, and undergarments. All of it well made, carefully stored, belonging to a woman who'd clearly lived here in this isolated valley and made it work. She changed into a simple wool dress that fit reasonably well. Mrs. Reed had been slightly taller but similar in build. The fabric was warm and clean and worlds better than her patched hand-me-downs. When she came downstairs, she found the dining table set for 3 and the smell of cooking meat filling the air. Marcus was busy in the kitchen, and Silas was bent over papers in his study. "Clara," Silas called when he heard her footsteps. "Come here, I want to show you something." She joined him at the desk, which was covered in maps, ledgers, and correspondence. "This is the operation," Silas said, pointing to a large map of the territory. "We've got cutting operations here, here, and here. 3 camps, about 40 men total. We cut selectively, not clear-cutting like some outfits do. Take the mature trees, leave the young ones to grow. It's slower, but more sustainable." Clara studied the map, noting the distances involved. "You cover a lot of ground. About 200 square miles of timber rights. Some we own outright, some we lease from the government or private landowners." He pulled out a ledger. "This is last year's accounts. Revenue, expenses, profit margins. Take a look." Clara opened the ledger and felt her eyebrows rise. The numbers were significant, very significant. "We cleared $80,000 last year," Silas said quietly. "After all expenses, payroll, equipment costs, everything." Clara did the math in her head. Her father's debt, the debt that had felt insurmountable, represented less than 1% of this operation's annual profit. "Silas," she said carefully, "you could have saved my father without marrying me." "Yes." "Then why?" "Because I don't give charity, Clara. I make deals." He met her eyes. "And because I meant what I said. I need a partner. Someone smart enough to help run this place. Someone who won't quit when winter lasts 8 months and the nearest town is a 2-day ride." "You're taking a hell of a gamble on someone you barely know." "So are you." He smiled slightly. "Seems fair." Marcus called them to dinner. Venison stew with vegetables that must have come from a root cellar, fresh bread that was somehow light and fluffy despite being made at altitude, and coffee strong enough to float horseshoes. "Tomorrow I'll show you the rest of the operation," Silas said between bites. "The sawmill, the storage barns, the equipment sheds. After that, we'll start on the business side. I want you familiar with the books before I head back out to the camps." "When do you leave?" Clara asked. "Week, maybe 2, depends on the weather." "And I'll stay here?" "Unless you want to live in a wall tent at 8,000 feet in February." Silas raised an eyebrow. "The camps aren't comfortable, Clara. There's a reason we rotate crews every 6 weeks." Clara absorbed this. She'd have the valley to herself, more or less, the lodge, the books, responsibility for an operation she still barely understood. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something else stirring, something that might have been excitement. "I want to learn everything," she heard herself say. "The cutting operations, the contracts, the buyers, all of it." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. "Ma'am, most women don't want anything to do with—" "I'm not most women," Clara interrupted. "And if I'm going to be here, I'm going to be useful." Silas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Fair enough. We start tomorrow at dawn." That night, Clara lay in the big bed in the master bedroom, her bedroom now, apparently, and stared at the ceiling. The wind howled outside, but inside the thick log walls, everything was warm and solid and safe. She thought about her father, hopefully recovering in the cabin with his debts cleared and his land secure. She thought about the town and the whispers and the assumptions everyone had made about poor Clara marrying a poor cowboy. And she thought about the ledger downstairs, with its neat columns of numbers that represented wealth beyond anything she'd imagined. Silas Boone had lied by omission, yes, But he'd also offered her something no one else ever had: respect, partnership, the chance to be more than just someone's daughter or someone's burden. She'd married him thinking she was trading herself for survival. Instead, she'd traded herself for possibility. And as she drifted off to sleep in a room warmer and more comfortable than anywhere she'd ever lived, Clara realized something that should probably have worried her but somehow didn't. She was starting to like Silas Boone. Not love. Nothing so foolish or impractical as that. But respect. And respect, she was beginning to understand, might be worth more than romance in the long run. Outside, the mountains stood silent under their burden of snow, and the hidden valley kept its secrets while Clara Whitmore, no, Clara Boone now, slept the sleep of someone who'd survived the hardest climb and found something unexpected waiting at the summit. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Clara had settled into the rhythm of the valley. She was in the study when Marcus brought it to her, his expression grim. Came through at the relay station. Runner brought it up this morning. Clara broke the seal and read the message twice, her stomach sinking with each word. Victor Boone requests Silas attend investor meeting Denver. March 15 stop. Concerns raised re-management practices. Stop attendance mandatory. Stop. She looked up at Marcus. What does this mean? The old man's jaw tightened. Means Victor's making his move. What move? The one he's been planning since Silas's father died. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat heavily. Victor's always thought he should be running this operation. He's older, he's got the connections in Denver, he knows the business side. When Silas inherited instead of him, he smiled and took the position managing contracts. But he's been waiting. Clara's mind raced through everything she'd learned in the past 6 weeks. The ledgers, the contracts, the careful balance of sustainable cutting and profit margins that Silas maintained against pressure from buyers who wanted faster, cheaper timber. Waiting for what? For Silas to make a mistake, or for enough investors to question his judgment that Victor can push him out. Marcus gestured at the telegram. This is it. This is Victor calling in favors and planting doubts and setting up a situation where Silas has to defend himself publicly. Can he do that? Push Silas out? Silas owns 60% of the operation outright, but the other 40% is held by investors who put up capital for expansion 3 years back. If enough of them vote no confidence, they can force restructuring, maybe even force a sale. Marcus's weathered face was troubled. Victor knows the numbers. He knows how to make sustainable forestry look like missed opportunity. He'll come at Silas hard. Clara folded the telegram carefully. When does Silas get back from the North Camp? Not for another week. Then we send a rider to bring him in early, and I need to see all the financial records for the past 3 years. Everything. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Clara, this is business. Men's business. Victor will tear into anyone who... I'm not just anyone, Clara interrupted quietly. I'm Silas's wife, and I've spent 6 weeks learning this operation inside and out. If Victor wants to question management practices, he's going to answer some questions himself. The old man studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the telegram arrived. Mrs. Reed would have liked you. She had that same fire. Tell me about the investors, Clara said, already pulling out the relevant ledgers. I need to know who we're dealing with. By the time Silas rode in 3 days later, Clara had transformed the study into a war room. Every ledger was open and cross-referenced. She'd made charts showing profit margins over 5 years, comparing Boone Timber's sustainable practices against competitors who clear-cut. She'd compiled reports from buyers praising the quality of their lumber. She'd even tracked down government surveys showing how their selective cutting preserved watersheds and prevented erosion that plagued other operations. Silas stood in the doorway, taking it all in. He was trail-worn and tired, his canvas coat dusted with snow, but his eyes were sharp as he scanned the organized chaos. Marcus told me you've been busy, he said finally. Victor's setting a trap, Claire replied without preamble. He's going to paint you as incompetent or reckless or both. He'll use numbers selectively, probably comparing our output to operations that strip land bare and destroy it for short-term profit. He'll make it look like you're costing investors money. He is. Silas moved to the desk, studying her charts. That's his job. Then we need to show why. Clara pointed to the watershed data. 3 of the operations Victor will compare us to have already been shut down by government order because their clear-cutting caused floods that destroyed towns downstream. 2 more are facing lawsuits. We haven't had a single environmental complaint in 10 years. Silas picked up one of her charts, a comparison of profit per acre over time. Where did you get this data? Trade publications, government reports. I sent letters to the Forest Service office in Denver. Clara met his eyes. You said you needed a partner who could handle things when you were gone. This needed handling. Something shifted in Silas's expression. You did all this in 3 days? I had help. Marcus knows which buyers to contact. The telegraph operator in town was cooperative once I explained what we needed. Clara paused. Silas, Victor's not just coming after your management. He's coming after your legitimacy. If we don't counter him with facts, he'll bury you in rhetoric. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the organized evidence she'd compiled. You understand he'll come after you too. Why would he? Because you're young, because you're a woman, because it'll look like I married some mountain girl who doesn't know business from a hole in the ground. Silas's voice was gentle but honest. Victor will use you as evidence that I'm making poor decisions. Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. She hadn't thought of that, hadn't considered that she might be a liability rather than an asset. Then I won't go, she said quietly. The hell you won't. Silas's response was immediate and fierce. You did this work. You found these numbers. If we're walking into that meeting, we're walking in together. But if I hurt your position, Clara. He waited until she looked at him. I didn't marry you to hide you when things got difficult. I married you because I thought you could handle difficult. Was I wrong? She thought about the past 6 weeks. The long nights learning timber grades and contract law. The ledgers she'd balanced down to the penny. The supply orders she'd managed. The payroll she'd processed. The 100 small decisions she'd made while Silas was in the field. No, she said. You weren't wrong. Then pack a bag. We leave for Denver in the morning. The train from the junction town was nothing like Clara had imagined. She'd seen trains before, the old spur line that used to serve Timber Falls, but that had been a rough logging train, functional and plain. This was the main line, with passenger cars that had velvet seats and brass fixtures and windows that looked out on terrain sliding past in a blur of white and green. Silas sat across from her in their private compartment, reading through the reports she'd compiled. He'd been quiet since they boarded, his focus entirely on the numbers and arguments they'd need to make. Clara watched the mountains give way to foothills, then to plains. She'd never been this far from home. Never seen landscape that stretched flat to the horizon. Never imagined cities could exist in places where mountains didn't hem in the sky. Nervous? Silas asked without looking up. Terrified, Clara admitted. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. He set down the papers. Victor's smart and he's ruthless. He'll try to rattle you. Don't let him. How do I stop him? By remembering that facts don't care about feelings. He can question your education or your background all he wants, but he can't change numbers. These profit margins are real. These sustainability reports are documented. The quality ratings from buyers are verified. Silas leaned forward. You know this business better than half the men in that room will. Trust that. The Hotel Grandview in Denver was the most intimidating building Clara had ever entered. 7 stories of brick and stone, with doormen in uniform and a lobby that featured marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Women in silk dresses moved through the space like exotic birds, and men in tailored suits conducted business over cigars and brandy. Clara felt every eye on her as she and Silas crossed to the front desk. She was wearing the best dress she owned, one of Mrs. Reed's, altered to fit, but it was still simple wool where everyone else wore elaborate fabrics. Her hair was braided and pinned, practical rather than fashionable. She looked exactly like what she was, a mountain girl out of her depth. Mr. and Mrs. Boone, Silas said to the desk clerk. We have a reservation. The clerk's eyebrow rose slightly at Clara, but he was professional enough to hide any other reaction. Of course, sir. Suite 412. The investor meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the Aspen Room. Their suite was larger than the entire cabin Clara had grown up in. Bedroom, sitting room, and a bathroom with running water and a porcelain tub that seemed designed for royalty. Clara stood in the middle of it all, feeling displaced in space and time. "You all right?" Silas asked, setting down their bags. "I don't belong here," Clara said quietly. "Neither do I." He gestured at his canvas coat, his worn boots. "I'm a logger, Clara. I cut trees and move timber. These people," he waved vaguely at the luxury surrounding them, "they move money and play games with other people's livelihoods. I hate every minute I have to spend in places like this." "Then why do it?" "Because running a business means playing the game whether you like it or not." Silas pulled off his coat. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Clara barely slept. She lay in the enormous bed. Silas had taken the sitting room couch without discussion and rehearsed numbers in her head. Profit margins, sustainability metrics, contract terms, everything she'd need to defend their position, if she was allowed to defend it at all. Morning brought a knock on the door and a delivery that made Clara's breath catch. 3 dress boxes, each one tied with ribbon. "What is this?" she asked Silas, who was already dressed and drinking coffee. "Insurance." He gestured to the boxes. "Open them." Inside were dresses unlike anything Clara had ever owned. The first was deep green wool, expertly tailored with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. The second was navy blue with pearl buttons. The third was burgundy with a fitted waist and elegant draping. "Silas, I can't." "You can and you will." His tone left no room for argument. "Victor's going to try to make you look like a country bumpkin who doesn't understand business. Don't give him the ammunition. Wear one of these, put your hair up properly, and walk into that room like you own it." "I don't know how to do any of that." "Then learn fast." But his voice softened. "Clara, you're the smartest person I know. You've mastered timber grades and contract law in 6 weeks. You can master looking the part for one afternoon." The hotel had a lady's maid available, and for an outrageous fee, she helped Clara into the green dress and arranged her hair in a style that was both elegant and severe. When Clara looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The mountain girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked like she belonged in marble lobbies and business meetings. "Better," Silas said when she emerged. "Now remember, you're not here to be decorative. You're here because you know the business. Act like it." The Aspen room was paneled in dark wood and dominated by a long conference table. 12 men were already seated when Silas and Clara entered, investors mostly, dressed in expensive suits and wearing expressions of polite skepticism. At the head of the table sat Victor Boone. He was older than Silas by perhaps 10 years, with silver threading through dark hair and a face that was handsome in a polished, urban way. He wore his wealth casually, the way men do when they've never been without it. When he saw Clara, his smile was brief and dismissive. "Silas," he said warmly, rising to shake hands, "good of you to come. And this must be your new bride. Congratulations on your marriage. How unexpected." The pause before unexpected was calculated. Clara felt its weight. "Clara, this is my uncle Victor," Silas said evenly. "Victor, my wife Clara. She's been managing the valley operations while I'm in the field." Victor's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "How ambitious. Please, both of you, sit." The next hour was brutal. Victor presented his case with the smooth competence of a man who'd spent weeks preparing. He had charts showing Boone Timber's output compared to competitors, graphs showing profit per acre that made their sustainable practices look inefficient, projections suggesting that with modern management, meaning clear-cutting and faster turnaround, profits could increase by 40%. The investors listened, asked questions, nodded thoughtfully. Several looked at Silas with expressions that suggested concern. "The fundamental problem," Victor concluded, "is that sentiment has replaced sound business practice. My nephew is an excellent woodsman. No one questions that. But running a multi-territory timber operation requires more than skill with an axe. It requires understanding markets, maximizing returns, and making hard decisions about efficiency." "Are you suggesting mismanagement?" one investor asked. "I'm suggesting missed opportunity." Victor's tone was reasonable, almost regretful. "The resource is there. The demand is there. We're simply not capitalizing on it because of an outdated approach to harvesting." He sat down, and every eye in the room turned to Silas. Silas stood slowly. Victor's numbers are accurate as far as they go. Yes, we could cut more timber if we stripped every accessible acre. Yes, short-term profits would increase. He paused. But I'd like to address what those numbers don't show. He gestured to Clara, who rose with her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must hear it. My wife has compiled some additional data that I believe is relevant to this discussion. Clara stepped to the front of the room, holding the folder of reports she'd prepared. Her hands wanted to shake. She forced them steady. Gentlemen, Mr. Boone's analysis focuses on output maximization. I'd like to discuss sustainability and long-term value. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. 3 of the operations he used for comparison, Cascade Timber, Rocky Mountain Logging, and Western Forest Products, have all been shut down by government order in the past 18 months due to environmental damage. She laid out the first report. Cascade Timber clear-cut a watershed in Montana. The resulting floods destroyed 2 towns and killed 14 people. The company is facing criminal charges and civil suits totaling over $2 million. One of the investors leaned forward, interested now. Rocky Mountain Logging stripped slopes in Wyoming so aggressively that erosion made the land unusable for any purpose. They're currently in bankruptcy, with assets seized to pay fines. Clara met their eyes. Western Forest Products clear-cut without regard to regeneration. The land they harvested 10 years ago is still barren. They'll never be able to log it again. She pulled out her comparison charts. Boone Timber's approach takes longer, yes. We're cutting at 70% of the volume these companies achieved, but we've maintained that 70% consistently for 20 years because our forests regenerate. Those companies spiked to 100% and then crashed to zero when the resource was exhausted or they were shut down. This is all very interesting, Victor interrupted smoothly, but Mrs. Boone is hardly an expert in what? Clara turned to face him directly. In reading government reports? In analyzing profit trends? In understanding that destroying your resource base for short-term gain is bad business? The room went quiet. Victor's smile tightened. My dear, I'm sure you've done your best to understand these complex matters, but your projections assume unlimited resource and no regulatory consequences. Clara interrupted, her voice calm but cutting. Both assumptions are false. The government is already drafting new forestry regulations. Companies with histories of environmental damage will face restricted access to public lands. Boone Timber, with its documented sustainability practices, will have preferred status. She pulled out another report. I have a letter here from the Regional Forest Service Director stating exactly that. Would you like me to read it? Victor's expression darkened. This is hardly... You question management practices, Clara continued. Let's examine them. Boone Timber maintains an injury rate 60% below industry average because we don't rush jobs or cut safety corners. Our timber grades consistently receive premium pricing because we select mature trees rather than harvesting everything indiscriminately. Our contracts include renewal clauses because buyers trust our supply will continue year after year. She turned to the investors. Mr. Boone suggested you could increase profits 40% through aggressive cutting. He's right, for exactly 3 years. Then you'd be left with exhausted land, government restrictions, and no viable business. Boone Timber's approach maintains steady profits indefinitely. Which sounds like better management to you? The silence that followed was different now, thoughtful rather than skeptical. One of the investors, a heavy-set man Clara recognized from the ledgers as Harrison, their largest private backer, spoke up. Mrs. Boone, you said you manage valley operations? Yes, sir. Financial records, supply chain, payroll, and coordination with field crews. And your background is? This was the moment Victor had been waiting for. Clara saw triumph flicker across his face. I grew up in a logging family in the Colorado high country, Clara said steadily. My father was a timberman before injury ended his career. I learned bookkeeping managing our household accounts. I learned resource management because we had to make limited resources last. And I learned this business by studying every ledger, contract, and report Boone Timber has generated in the past 5 years. She paused. I may not have a formal education in business, Mr. Harrison, but I understand numbers, and these numbers speak clearly. Harrison smiled. I believe they do. He turned to Victor. Your analysis assumed we should follow the same model as companies that are now bankrupt or facing criminal charges. That seems poorly reasoned. I was simply suggesting, Victor began. You were suggesting we sacrifice long-term stability for short-term gain, another investor interrupted. Mrs. Boone has demonstrated why that's foolish. Victor's face flushed. With all due respect, gentlemen, are we really going to let some mountain girl who's been playing at business for a few weeks? Some mountain girl who understands sustainability better than you apparently do, Harrison said sharply. I've been in timber for 30 years, Victor. I've seen a dozen operations go under because they stripped land bare and moved on. Boone Timber is one of the few companies I trust to still be standing in 20 years. That's because of practices you're suggesting we abandon. Victor stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're letting a woman with no experience, a woman who just presented a more thorough analysis than you did, a third investor said. Sit down, Victor. But Victor didn't sit. He turned to Silas, his urbane mask cracking to show genuine anger beneath. You really think marrying some ignorant country girl and letting her play at business makes you look competent? It makes you look desperate. Careful, Silas said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. She's made a fool of you, Silas. Can't you see that? Parading around in borrowed dresses, pretending she understands. Mr. Boone, Clara's voice cut through the tension. I'm standing right here. If you have something to say about my competence, say it to me. Victor turned on her, and for the first time she saw real contempt in his face. You want honesty? Fine. You're a pretty little nobody who got lucky enough to trap a wealthy man. You've learned a few terms and memorized some numbers, but you don't understand business. You don't understand how the world actually works. And you certainly don't belong in this room. Clara met his eyes without flinching. You're right. I don't come from money. I don't have connections or a prestigious education. What I have is the ability to read a balance sheet and recognize that your entire proposal relies on destroying what you claim to be managing. She gestured to the report spread on the table. Every claim I made is documented. Every number is verified. You can dismiss me all you want, but you can't dismiss facts. Facts selected by an amateur who doesn't understand. Then correct me, Clara challenged. Show me where my analysis is wrong. Show me how clear-cutting leads to sustainable profits. Show me how copying companies that are now bankrupt is sound business practice. She waited. Or admit that my background doesn't matter because the facts speak for themselves. Victor stared at her, his jaw working. Around the table, investors watched with expressions ranging from amusement to approval. Finally, Harrison spoke. I believe Mrs. Boone has made her point, and quite effectively. He turned to Silas. You've got my continued support. The current management approach is sound. Other investors nodded agreement. Victor's hands clenched into fists. This is over, Silas said quietly. He stood, offering Clara his arm. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Victor, I'll expect your resignation from the Denver office by the end of the week. You're clearly not aligned with this company's direction anymore. Victor's face went white. You can't. I can. 60% ownership, remember? Silas's voice was calm but absolute. You just spent an hour trying to undermine me in front of investors and insulting my wife. I'm done being patient. He guided Clara toward the door. This isn't over, Victor called after them. You can't run this operation without me. Silas paused at the door. Watch me. They left to absolute silence. In the hallway, Clara's legs nearly gave out. Adrenaline drained from her system, leaving her shaking. Silas steadied her with a hand on her elbow. You all right? He asked. I think I'm going to be sick. Not in the fancy hallway. Wait until we're in the suite. But by the time they reached their rooms, the nausea had passed, replaced by something else. Clara sank into a chair, her mind replaying the confrontation. I called your uncle a fool in front of his peers, she said numbly. You proved he was a fool in front of his peers, Silas corrected. There's a difference. He hates me now. He hated you the moment you walked in looking competent. Silas poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed her one. Clara, you just saved this company. You understand that, right? I just repeated what you already knew. I knew the facts. but I would have presented them wrong. Too defensive, too technical. He sat across from her. You made it simple. You made it about their money and their risk. That's what they cared about, and you gave them exactly what they needed to hear. Clara sipped the whiskey, felt it burn warmth through her chest. Victor's not going to let this go. No, he won't. Silas's expression was grim. He'll regroup, find another angle. But he lost today, and he lost publicly. That matters. What happens now? Now I fire him from the Denver office and find someone else to manage contracts. Now we go home to the valley. Now you stop playing at business and actually run the operation while I'm in the field. Silas raised his glass. To my wife, who apparently has a gift for making powerful enemies. Clara clinked her glass against his. I learned from watching you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the Denver sunset paint the mountains gold. Somewhere below, in the marble lobby, investors were probably discussing what they'd witnessed. Somewhere in the hotel, Victor was probably plotting revenge. But for this moment, Clara felt something she hadn't expected. Pride. She'd walked into that room terrified and walked out having defended not just a business decision, but her own worth. She'd faced contempt and dismissal and hadn't backed down. The mountain girl who'd counted fence posts in despair was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who'd claimed her voice and used it, and whatever came next, whatever Victor planned or the investors decided or the future held, Clara knew one thing for certain. She'd never go back to being silent again. The invitation arrived 3 weeks after they returned to the valley, delivered by a courier who'd ridden 2 days through late spring snow to place the cream-colored envelope in Clara's hands. She recognized the penmanship immediately. Elegant, precise, expensive. The kind of handwriting taught in finishing schools back east, where girls learned that the proper slope of a letter indicated breeding as surely as bloodlines. Mrs. Evelyn Boone requests the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Silas Boone's company at dinner, Saturday the 23rd of April, 7 o'clock, at the Boone residence, Capitol Hill, Denver. Clara read it twice, then handed it to Silas, who'd just come in from inspecting the new sawmill equipment. He glanced at it and swore quietly. Victor's wife, he said, setting the invitation on the desk like it might contaminate something. I was wondering when she'd make her move. Her move? Clara looked between the elegant paper and her husband's grim expression. What does that mean? It means Victor lost the business battle, so now Evelyn's opening a social front. Silas pulled off his work gloves. She's Denver society, Clara. Old money, old family, all the right connections. If she can't get to me through investors, she'll try to destroy my credibility through reputation. Clara's stomach tightened. By going after me. By making you look unsuitable, uneducated, common. He met her eyes. She'll invite other society women, probably some of the investors' wives. She'll ask questions about your background, your family, your education. Every answer you give will be used to prove I made a poor choice marrying beneath my station. Then we don't go. We have to go. Silas's voice was heavy. Refusing an invitation like this is the same as admitting we're afraid. It gives Evelyn exactly what she wants, evidence that you can't handle society, that I'm ashamed of you, that Victor was right about my judgment. Clara sank into the desk chair, her mind already racing through the implications. She'd survived the investor meeting through preparation and facts. But this was different. This wasn't about numbers and sustainability reports. This was about etiquette and social graces and all the unwritten rules she'd never learned because mountain girls didn't get invited to society dinners. I don't know how to do this, she said quietly. Neither do I. Silas pulled up a chair beside her. I hate these things, always have. But Evelyn knows that, and she's counting on us being uncomfortable enough to make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? Using the wrong fork, addressing people incorrectly, not knowing which topics are acceptable for discussion. He paused. Or worse, trying to pretend you're something you're not and being caught at it. Clara looked at the invitation again, at the elegant script that seemed designed to intimidate. So what do? We go. We're honest about who you are, and we don't apologize for it. Silas's jaw set. You walked into that investor meeting and faced down Victor with nothing but facts and backbone. You can do this too. That was business. Clara struggled to find words. This is them judging whether I'm good enough to be your wife. And their judgment doesn't matter. Silas took her hand. You are my wife. You run this operation when I'm gone. You've saved this company once already. What some society women think about your table manners doesn't change any of that. Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd seen how Victor looked at her in that conference room, the contempt, the dismissal, the absolute certainty that she didn't belong. Evelyn would be worse. Evelyn would be subtle and cruel and surgical in her attacks. I need to prepare, Clara said finally. Then we prepare. Silas stood. I'll send word we're accepting. You figure out what you need to learn. What Clara needed to learn, it turned out, was everything. She started with books ordered from Denver. Etiquette manuals, guides to formal dining, primers on society conversation. She studied them the way she'd studied the timber ledgers, memorizing rules that seemed designed to exclude anyone who hadn't been born knowing them. The soup spoon goes on the outside. Never discuss money, politics, or religion. Address a married woman as Mrs. unless she invites you to use her Christian name. Keep your elbows off the table. Don't speak until spoken to by your hostess. It was a different kind of language, as complex and foreign as any she'd encountered. Marcus found her in the study one afternoon, surrounded by open books and handwritten notes, practicing holding a fork the way the etiquette manual insisted was proper. You're going to that dinner, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And you're scared. Clara set down the fork. Terrified. The old man pulled up a chair. Miss Reed went to one of those Denver Society things once. Came back madder than a wet cat. You know what she told me? What? She said those women spent 3 hours talking about absolutely nothing and acting like it was profound conversation. They judged each other on dress quality and proper pronunciation while their husbands lost money on bad investments and worse whiskey. Marcus smiled slightly. She said it was the most useless waste of a perfectly good evening she'd ever experienced. That doesn't make me feel better. It should, because Mrs. Reed was smarter than any of those society ladies, same as you're smarter than Evelyn Boone. He gestured at the etiquette books. This isn't about knowing which fork to use, Clara. It's about Evelyn trying to make you feel small. Don't let her. Easy to say. Harder to do when I don't know the rules. Then change the game, Marcus stood. You did it in that investor meeting. You can do it again. But Clara wasn't sure. The investor meeting had been about facts and numbers, solid ground where she could stand firm. A society dinner was quicksand, where every word and gesture could be judged and found wanting by standards she barely understood. Still, she kept studying. She practiced conversation topics. She worked on posture and proper address. She even had one of the dresses from Denver altered to be more formal, appropriate for an evening event. The night before they were due to leave for Denver, Silas found her in the bedroom, staring at herself in the mirror and seeing all her inadequacies reflected back. You look beautiful, he said from the doorway. I look like a fraud. Clara touched the silk of her dress, deep blue, expertly tailored, expensive. I'm wearing borrowed elegance and pretending it's mine. It is yours. You earned it. Silas crossed to stand behind her, both of them reflected in the glass. Clara, listen to me. Evelyn's going to try to make you feel inferior. She'll ask about your education, your family, your background. Every question will be designed to highlight what you lack. I know. So don't pretend to be something you're not. Tell the truth. He met her eyes in the mirror. You grew up poor. Your father was a logger. You didn't attend finishing school or learn to play piano. None of that is shameful. It's just fact. Facts that prove I don't belong in their world. Facts that prove you built yourself from nothing into someone who runs a successful timber operation. Silas's hand settled on her shoulders. That's worth more than knowing which fork to use. Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the way society worked, even in small ways. The church ladies in Timber Falls who judged families by their Sunday clothes, the banker who'd dismissed her father because injury had made him poor. The world didn't care what you'd overcome. It only cared what you currently lacked. What if I humiliate you? She whispered. You won't. But if I do, Clara. He turned her to face him. The only way you could humiliate me is by not being yourself. I didn't marry you because you knew society rules. I married you because you're smart and tough and honest. Don't lose that trying to impress people who don't matter. The Boone residence on Capitol Hill was a 3-story Victorian mansion that made the Hotel Grandview look modest. Gas lamps lined the curved drive, manicured gardens stretched into the darkness. Through tall windows, Clara could see chandeliers blazing with what must have been 100 candles. Her courage nearly failed right there. "Steady," Silas murmured, offering his arm as they climbed the front steps. A butler, an actual butler in formal livery, opened the door and announced them with grave formality. Mr. and Mrs. Silas Boone. The entrance hall was all marble and gilt, with a sweeping staircase that belonged in a palace. Clara forced herself to walk normally, to not gawk like the mountain girl she was. Evelyn Boone materialized from a side room, and Clara's first thought was that she looked exactly like her handwriting, elegant, precise, and coldly beautiful. She was perhaps 40, dressed in emerald silk that probably cost more than Clara's father's cabin. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears. Her smile was perfect and utterly devoid of warmth. "Silas, darling," she said, offering her cheek for a kiss that Silas gave with obvious reluctance. "How wonderful to see you, and this must be your bride." Her eyes swept over Clara in assessment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and catalogued every inadequacy. "How lovely. Please, come in. Everyone's dying to meet you." Everyone turned out to be 8 other guests, arranged in the drawing room with drinks and conversation. Clara recognized 2 of the investors from the Denver meeting and their wives. The others were introduced as business associates and society friends, their names washing over her in a blur of syllables she'd never remember. "Mrs. Boone," said one of the wives, Mrs. Harrison, married to the heavy-set investor who'd supported them. "I hear you're from Colorado originally?" "Yes, ma'am, the mountain country west of Denver." "How charming. And your family, are they in business?" The question sounded innocent. It wasn't. Clara could see Evelyn watching from across the room, waiting. "My father was a timberman," Clara said clearly. "He worked the high country logging operations before injury ended his career." "I see. And your mother?" "Died when I was 14. "How tragic." Mrs. Harrison's sympathy seemed genuine. "You must have had to grow up quite quickly." "I did." Clara met her eyes. "It taught me resourcefulness." Evelyn glided closer, her smile still fixed in place. "And your education, my dear? Did you attend school in the mountains?" "Such as it was available, yes." Clara refused to drop her gaze. "One-room schoolhouse with whatever books the school mistress could acquire. I learned reading, writing, and mathematics well enough to manage accounts." "No finishing school, then? No music or languages or art?" "No, ma'am. Just practical subjects." "How very, practical." Evelyn's tone made it sound like a character flaw. "Though I suppose in the mountains there's little use for culture." "There's little use for pretension," Clara replied quietly. "We tend to value substance over decoration." A flicker of something crossed Evelyn's perfect face. Annoyance, perhaps, or respect for a hit that landed. How refreshingly direct, though I do hope you'll find Denver society isn't entirely without substance. Dinner was announced before Clara could respond, which was probably fortunate. They moved to a dining room that featured a table set for 12 with more silverware than Clara had ever seen in one place. Crystal glasses, china plates with gold rims, napkins folded into elaborate shapes. It was a display of wealth designed to intimidate. Clara found her place card between one of the society friends, a Mrs. Ashford, and a business associate whose name she'd already forgotten. Silas was seated at the opposite end of the table, too far away to help. That was intentional, Clara knew. Evelyn wanted her isolated. The meal began with soup served in delicate bowls. Clara watched Mrs. Ashford select the proper spoon and followed her lead. So far, so good. "Mrs. Boone," Mrs. Ashford said pleasantly, "I understand you've taken quite an interest in your husband's business affairs. How unusual." "I manage the valley operations when Silas is in the field," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "Someone has to handle the accounts and coordinate with suppliers." How very industrious. Though I must confess, I can't imagine concerning myself with such matters. My husband handles all our business affairs. I find it so much more pleasant to focus on social obligations and cultural pursuits. I'm sure that works well when you have that luxury, Clara replied. Growing up the way I did, I learned to handle whatever needed handling. Oh, of course, how admirable. Mrs. Ashford's tone suggested it was anything but. Though I do hope you're finding time to develop more refined interests now that you're in a position to do so. From the head of the table, Evelyn's voice cut through the murmured conversations. Clara, dear, you must tell us about your courtship. I understand it was quite brief. Every conversation stopped. All eyes turned to Clara. This was it, the moment Evelyn had been building toward. Very brief, Clara said calmly. Silas and I met, discussed terms, and married within 2 days. Terms? One of the other wives looked scandalized. How very businesslike. It was businesslike, Clara agreed. Silas needed a partner who could handle the isolation and responsibility of running a mountain timber operation. She paused, making a choice. I needed to save my father's life. He was ill, and we were facing foreclosure. Silas paid our debts. I married him. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara could hear Crystal chiming somewhere, a servant moving in another room. Evelyn's smile turned razor sharp. So it was a financial arrangement. How very candid of you to admit it. Why wouldn't I admit it? Clara met her gaze directly. It's the truth. Most marriages involve financial considerations. I was simply more honest about it than most. But surely you didn't marry only for money, Mrs. Harrison said, looking uncomfortable. I married for survival, Clara corrected. There's a difference. And Silas married for partnership, which he got. I've managed his valley operations, handled his accounts, and defended his business practices before investors who questioned his judgment. I'd say we both kept our end of the bargain. How perfectly mercenary, Evelyn murmured, and here I thought marriage was about love and companionship. Love is a luxury, Clara said quietly. When you're watching your father die and counting days until you lose everything, you make practical choices. I'm not ashamed of that. Of course not, dear. Evelyn's voice dripped false sympathy. Though I do wonder what Silas's family would have thought. His mother, for instance, came from quite a prominent family. I'm sure she had different expectations for her son's marriage. His mother is dead, Clara said flatly. So we'll never know. Yes, how convenient. Evelyn sipped her wine. No in-laws to judge your suitability. Something cold settled in Clara's chest. This woman wasn't just trying to make her uncomfortable. She was trying to humiliate her, to make her feel like a gold digger who'd trapped an eligible man through desperate circumstances. Mrs. Boone, Clara said, her voice carrying across the table, if you have something to say about my marriage or my character, please say it directly instead of hiding behind innuendo. The room went utterly still. Evelyn set down her wine glass with deliberate care. I'm simply observing that marrying for money rather than affection is unconventional. And I'm observing that attacking your husband's nephew's wife at your own dinner table is remarkably petty. Clara's voice was calm but steel-edged. Your husband lost a business dispute. That's unfortunate for him. But taking your frustration out on me won't change the outcome. I have no idea what you mean. Yes, you do. Clara stood, setting her napkin beside her plate with the same deliberate care Evelyn had used. You invited us here to prove I'm unsuitable, to demonstrate that I don't know proper etiquette or educated conversation, to make me feel inferior so you can tell everyone Silas made a poor choice. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every guest. You're right that I didn't attend finishing school. I can't speak French or play piano. I don't know the difference between a salad fork and a fish fork without watching someone else first. But I can read a balance sheet, negotiate a timber contract, and run a successful operation that employs 40 men and generates sustainable profits. Clara turned back to Evelyn. I'm not ashamed of where I come from or what I lack in social graces. I'm proud of what I've built from nothing. If that makes me unsuitable in your eyes, I genuinely don't care. Your approval isn't required for my marriage or my life. She looked to Silas, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I think I'd like to leave now. He stood immediately. Agreed. You can't just leave in the middle of dinner, Evelyn said, her composure finally cracking. It's incredibly rude. No ruder than spending an entire evening trying to make your guest feel worthless. Clara moved toward the door. Thank you for the dinner invitation, Mrs. Boone. I won't be accepting another. They were in the entrance hall before Evelyn caught up with them, her silk dress rustling like angry leaves. You have no idea what you've done, she hissed, dropping all pretense of civility. I'll make sure everyone knows what you are, a fortune hunter, a nobody who trapped a wealthy man through desperate circumstances. Clara turned to face her one last time. Tell them, tell everyone. I'd rather be an honest nobody than a cruel somebody who has nothing better to do than torture people at dinner parties. She walked out into the night with her head high and her heart hammering, Silas beside her and the bright windows of the mansion spilling light behind them, like judgment. They made it to their hotel before Clara's composure shattered. She sank onto the couch in their suite and covered her face with her hands, shaking. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, Silas said quietly, or the most foolish. It was honest, Clara said through her fingers. I couldn't sit there and let her cut me apart piece by piece. I know. He sat beside her. And for what it's worth, half that room was on your side. Clara looked up. What? Mrs. Harrison caught me on the way out, said Evelyn had been insufferable for years, and someone needed to tell her so. Silas smiled slightly. 2 of the other wives agreed, said they'd never seen anyone stand up to Evelyn like that. And the other half thinks I'm a rude, uneducated peasant who doesn't know her place. Probably. Silas shrugged. But those people already thought that before tonight. You didn't lose anything you actually had. Clara leaned back against the couch, exhausted. She's going to make trouble. She already was making trouble. This just brings it into the open. He took her hand. Clara, you could have sat through that dinner and taken everything she threw at you. You could have smiled and pretended it didn't hurt and let her win. But you didn't. You stood up for yourself. And probably made an enemy for life. Probably. Silas squeezed her hand. But I'd rather have you as an honest enemy of Evelyn Boone than a broken version of yourself trying to please her. They sat in silence for a long moment, Clara's mind replaying the evening, the deliberate cruelty, the calculated attacks, her own decision to stop taking it and fight back. What happens now? She asked finally. Now Evelyn tells her version of tonight to everyone she knows, probably paints you as rude and ungrateful. Silas considered. But some people, the ones who matter, will see through it, and some might even respect what you did. And Victor? Victor lost his position with the company. His wife just failed to destroy your reputation. They're out of moves, Clara. At least for now. Clara wasn't so sure. People like Victor and Evelyn didn't stop fighting just because they lost battles. They regrouped and found new angles of attack. But tonight, at least, Clara had won something important. Not the social approval she'd never have anyway, but something better. Her own voice. Her own dignity. Her own refusal to be made small by people who measured worth in silver patterns and proper pronunciation. 3 days later, back in the valley, a letter arrived from Denver. Clara opened it, expecting another attack from Evelyn. Instead, it was from Mrs. Harrison. Dear Mrs. Boone, I wanted to write and express my admiration for your conduct at Mrs. Evelyn Boone's dinner. In 30 years of Denver society, I have never seen anyone stand up to her particular brand of cruelty with such grace and honesty. You asked, quite correctly, why she couldn't simply state her objections directly rather than hide behind innuendo. I can answer that. Because women like Evelyn have been taught that indirect cruelty is more acceptable than honest confrontation. You refused to play that game, and it was refreshing. My husband and I would be honored if you and Silas would join us for dinner next month. No formal affair, no society guests, just the 4 of us. I find I'm quite curious to know you better without Evelyn's poisonous influence. Additionally, my women's charitable organization is looking for someone with business acumen to help us improve our resource management. We provide education and training for young women without family support. Given your own background and obvious capabilities, I wondered if you might be interested in consulting work. It would be paid, of course, and entirely independent of your husband's business. Please do consider it. I believe you have much to offer, and I'd hate to see your talents wasted avoiding Denver simply because one spiteful woman tried to make you uncomfortable. Yours truly, Margaret Harrison. Clara read the letter 3 times before showing it to Silas. Well, he said when he finished reading, looks like you made an impression after all. Consulting work, Clara said slowly, independent income. Completely independent. That's smart of Margaret. She knows offering charity would insult you, so she's offering partnership instead. Clara thought about the women's charitable organization. Education for young women without family support. Girls like she'd been, smart and capable, but lacking opportunity. She could help them, not with charity, but with practical skills, bookkeeping, contract negotiation, business management, everything she'd learned by necessity. I want to do it, she said. Then do it. Silas handed back the letter. You don't need my permission, Clara. I know, but I wanted you to know anyway. He smiled. Write to Margaret, set up the consulting arrangement, and maybe consider that dinner invitation too. I'm curious to know her without Evelyn's poisonous influence as well. That evening, Clara sat at the desk in the study and composed her response. Her handwriting wasn't elegant like Evelyn's, it was practical and clear, shaped by ledgers rather than finishing school. But it was honest, and it was hers. Dear Mrs. Harrison, thank you for your kind letter. I would be honored to consult with your organization and to accept your dinner invitation. I must warn you, however, that my skills are entirely practical rather than theoretical. I can teach bookkeeping and resource management, but not embroidery or proper tea service. If that's acceptable to you, then I believe we have the basis for a productive partnership. Yours sincerely, Clara Boone. She sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning post. Outside, the valley lay quiet under spring stars, and somewhere in Denver, Evelyn Boone was probably still plotting revenge. But Clara had found something more valuable than approval or acceptance. She'd found allies who valued substance over decoration, work that would let her help girls like she'd been, and most importantly, proof that standing up for herself, even when it was terrifying, could open doors she'd never imagined existed. The mountain girl who'd married for survival was becoming something new, not a society lady. Never that. But a woman with her own income, her own authority, and her own growing influence. She'd stopped surviving and started building. And she was just getting started. The telegram came in October, carried up the mountain by a rider who'd pushed through the first serious snow of the season to deliver it. Clara was in the new training building when Marcus found her, his face telling her everything before he spoke. She'd been teaching 3 young women the basics of timber accounting, showing them how to track inventory and calculate board feet when the old man appeared in the doorway. Clara, he said quietly, it's your father. She knew. Of course she knew. She'd known since August when she'd visited and seen how thin he'd become, how his breathing labored even on good days. She'd known, but knowing didn't make the words hurt less. The telegram was brief. Thomas Whitmore had passed peacefully in his sleep. The neighbor who'd been checking on him had found him that morning, looking more at rest than he had in months. Clara read it standing in the middle of the training room, aware of the 3 young women watching her with concern, aware of Marcus waiting for her to fall apart. She didn't fall apart. I need to go home, she said, her voice steady despite the grief crushing her chest. Can you handle things here? Of course. Marcus stepped closer. I'll send word to Silas at the North Camp. He'll want to know. Clara nodded. She turned to the young women, Sarah, Beth, and Annie, all of them in their late teens, all of them receiving the education Clara wished she'd had at their age. We'll continue the lesson next week. Practice the calculations I showed you. They murmured condolences she barely heard. Clara was already moving, already planning. She needed to ride to Timber Falls, needed to arrange the burial, needed to handle all the practical details that death required, because that's what she did now. She handled things. The funeral was small. A dozen people from town who remembered Thomas Whitmore when he'd been a strong logger with a future ahead of him. Mrs. Chen, who'd given Clara advice that had changed her life. The banker Winters, looking uncomfortable. And Clara, standing in the church she'd been married in 7 months ago, listening to words about eternal rest and loving mercy, and trying to feel something other than numb. Silas arrived halfway through the service, snow still melting on his shoulders from the hard ride down from the north camp. He slipped into the pew beside her and took her hand without speaking. Clara gripped it like an anchor. They buried Thomas Whitmore in the mountain cemetery where Clara's mother already lay. The ground was half frozen and the gravediggers had struggled, but they got it done. Clara stood at the graveside and remembered her father teaching her to read by lamplight, teaching her to think for herself even when the world said girls didn't need education, teaching her that poverty didn't mean worthlessness. "Thank you," she whispered to the fresh-turned earth. "Thank you for giving me the tools to survive." After the burial, they went to the cabin that was legally hers now, with the deed clear and the debts paid. It looked smaller than Clara remembered, the rooms that had once contained her entire world now seeming cramped and poor compared to the Valley Lodge. But it was paid for. Her father had died in his own home, on his own land, with his dignity intact. That mattered. "What will you do with it?" Silas asked, standing in the main room where Clara had grown up. "I don't know yet." Clara touched the table her father had built, the chairs he'd carved. "Part of me wants to keep it. Part of me knows that's just sentiment." "Sentiment isn't always wrong." "No, but it's not always practical either." Clara turned to face him. "What would you do?" Silas considered. "I'd offer it to someone who needs it. Someone in circumstances like you were in. Let them have the same chance you got." It was the right answer. Clara knew it immediately. The cabin could save someone else's life the way her marriage to Silas had saved hers. "There's a young widow in town," she said slowly, "Martha Brennan. Her husband died in a mining accident last year. She's been trying to hold on with 3 children and no support. This land could give her a fresh start." "Then give it to her. Just like that?" "Why not?" Silas shrugged. "You don't need it? She does. Seems simple to me." Clara thought about Martha Brennan, who she'd seen at the general store buying the cheapest supplies and counting pennies. Thought about 3 children growing up the way Clara had, with too much worry and not enough hope. "I'll need to set up terms," Clara said, already thinking through the details. "Make sure she can actually maintain the property. Maybe arrange some initial supplies to help her get started." "There's my practical wife," Silas smiled slightly, always turning kindness into a business plan. Kindness without structure is just charity. Structure gives people dignity. Clara pulled off her gloves. "I learned that from Margaret Harrison's organization. Give people tools and training, not handouts." Over the past 5 months, Clara's consulting work with the Women's Education Organization had grown from a few hours a month to a substantial commitment. She'd developed a curriculum teaching practical business skills, bookkeeping, contract reading, negotiation tactics. She'd helped place 12 young women in paid positions where they could support themselves. And she'd discovered something unexpected. She was good at this. Not just competent, but genuinely skilled at seeing potential in others and helping them develop it. Margaret Harrison had called her a natural teacher. Clara had laughed at that. Mountain girls didn't become teachers. But maybe mountain girls who'd learned to survive could teach other people to do the same. They spent 2 days in Timber Falls settling her father's affairs. Clara gave the cabin and land to Martha Brennan, who cried and tried to refuse until Clara made it clear this was business, not charity. In return, Martha would maintain the property, pay a nominal annual fee to cover taxes, and eventually pass the opportunity to someone else in need. "Your father would be proud," Silas said as they rode back toward the valley, the cabin disappearing behind them. "Would he?" Clara wasn't sure. "I married a stranger for money, used his wealth to build a life he never got to see." "You married a stranger to save his life. Gave him 2 more years of dignity and peace." Silas glanced at her. "And you used what you learned to help other people avoid the same desperation. I'd say that's something to be proud of." Clara thought about that as they climbed into the high country, leaving the world of her childhood behind for the last time. Her father was gone. The cabin was no longer hers. The mountain girl who'd counted fence posts in despair existed only in memory now. In her place rode someone new, someone with authority and income and influence, someone who'd learned to turn survival skills into actual power. The valley looked different when they returned. Or maybe Clara looked at it differently, seeing it now as the center of something larger than just a timber operation. The lodge had become a training ground where young workers learned sustainable forestry. The new building she'd commissioned housed the education program she was developing. The valley itself had grown from Silas's inherited operation into something they were building together. Marcus met them at the stable, looking older than he had just days ago. The news of Thomas Whitmore's death had hit him hard. He'd lost Mrs. Reed 3 years back and understood grief in ways most people didn't. "Everything all right here?" Clara asked, dismounting. "Smooth as silk. Sarah and the girls handled the accounts while you were gone. Did a fine job, too." Marcus took the horse's reins. "And you got a letter from Denver. Looks official." The letter was from Margaret Harrison, and it contained news that made Clara read it twice to be sure she understood correctly. "Dear Clara, our women's education organization has grown substantially thanks to your curriculum and training programs. We now have requests from 3 other cities asking to replicate our model. The board has voted unanimously to offer you a paid directorship position, managing the expansion of these programs across the territory. The position would require significant travel and time commitment, but we believe you're the only person qualified to lead this work. The salary is $3,000 annually, with additional compensation for travel expenses. This would be entirely your own income, independent of any family or marital connection. I know you have substantial responsibilities with the timber operation, but I wanted to extend this offer before approaching anyone else. Please consider it carefully. Yours truly, Margaret Harrison." $3,000. That was... Claire did the math quickly. That was more than many men earned in skilled professions. That was enough to live independently if she chose. That was real money, not pocket change or allowance. "Good news?" Silas asked, reading her expression. Clara handed him the letter. He read it, his eyebrows rising. "They want you to run the entire territorial program," he said. "Yes." "That's a significant position." "Yes." He looked at her carefully. "What do you want to do?" Clara sat down at the desk, her mind racing. 6 months ago, she would have refused immediately. Her job was here, managing the valley operation while Silas worked the camps. That was their arrangement. That was the deal they'd made. But things had changed. She'd changed. The valley ran smoothly now, even when she traveled to Denver for consulting work. Sarah and the other young women she'd trained were perfectly capable of handling day-to-day operations. Marcus could manage the rest. And this position would let her help hundreds of women instead of dozens. Let her build something that could change lives across the entire territory. "I want to do it," she said finally, "but I don't want to abandon the valley operation." "You wouldn't be abandoning it. You'd be expanding your role." Silas pulled up a chair. "Clara, when I married you, I needed someone to manage things while I was gone. You've done that so well that the operation runs itself now. Maybe it's time for you to build something of your own." "This is something of my own? The timber business is mine. I inherited it from my father. But this education program, you built that from nothing. That's yours." He paused. "And you're good at it. Better than you are at timber accounting, if I'm being honest." Clara smiled despite herself. "Are you saying I'm a mediocre bookkeeper?" "I'm saying you're a brilliant teacher and organizer who settled for being a good bookkeeper because that's what the situation required." Silas took her hand. "Take the position, Clara. Build your program. I'll handle the valley." "But that wasn't our agreement. Agreements can change. We can renegotiate." He smiled. "That's what partners do." The word hit Clara harder than she expected. Partners. Not husband and wife in the traditional sense, where the wife managed the home while the husband managed business, but actual partners, each bringing different skills and building different things while supporting each other's work. "I'd be traveling constantly," Clara said, "setting up programs in different cities, training new instructors. I'd be gone as much as you are." "Then we'll both be gone a lot and both be building things that matter." Silas shrugged. "Doesn't sound that different from now, except you'll be doing work you actually care about, instead of work you're just competent at." Clara thought about the young women she'd taught over the past months. Girls like Sarah, who'd arrived knowing nothing about business and was now managing complex timber accounts. Girls like Beth, who'd learned negotiation skills and secured a position with a supply company at twice the wage they initially offered. Girls like Annie, who was teaching herself contract law and planning to apply for a bookkeeping position with the railroad. She'd given them tools. She could give those same tools to hundreds more. I'll need to set conditions, Clara said. Structure for how the valley operates when neither of us is here. Clear lines of authority, proper training for whoever takes over daily management. See? Already turning it into a business plan. Silas stood. Write to Margaret. Accept the position. We'll work out the details. Clara drafted her acceptance letter that evening, sitting at the desk where she'd learned timber business and discovered she was better at teaching it than doing it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd married Silas thinking she'd manage his operation. Instead, she was building her own. The next 6 months transformed the valley. Clara hired and trained a full-time operations manager, a young man named David Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew from San Francisco, who had formal business education and natural aptitude for logistics. She created detailed procedures for every aspect of the operation, from payroll to supply ordering to contract management. She established regular reporting systems so she and Silas could stay informed even when traveling, and she traveled constantly. Denver first, where Margaret Harrison's organization became the headquarters for the territorial expansion. Then Colorado Springs, where Clara established the second training program. Then Boulder, Pueblo, Grand Junction. Each city required finding space, recruiting instructors, developing local partnerships, and most importantly, finding the young women who needed these skills. Clara discovered she was good at all of it. She could read a room and identify allies. She could negotiate for donated space and reduced fees. She could spot potential in girls others overlooked. She could teach not just skills but confidence. The belief that poverty and lack of formal education didn't mean lack of capability. By the following spring, she was managing programs in 8 cities, employing 16 instructors, and serving over 200 students. The organizational board increased her salary to $5,000 annually and gave her complete autonomy over program development. Clara Boone, who'd grown up counting pennies and wearing patched dresses, now had her own income that exceeded what many men earned in their lifetimes. She and Silas saw each other perhaps 1 week out of every month, crossing paths in the valley or occasionally meeting in Denver when their schedules aligned. It should have been strange, this marriage, where they lived mostly separate lives, but somehow it worked. They talked business over dinner, Clara describing challenges with a new program, Silas explaining complications with a timber contract. They'd review the valley operations together, making joint decisions about expansion and investment. And sometimes late at night, when they were both exhausted from travel and work, they'd sit on the lodge porch and just exist in comfortable silence. It wasn't romance. It had never been romance. But it was partnership in the truest sense. 2 people building separate things while supporting each other's success. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one night, watching stars wheel overhead. "Marrying me instead of someone who'd actually be here?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret marrying me instead of someone you loved?" "I didn't have other options." "That's not what I asked." Clara thought about it honestly. "No, I don't regret it. This life, what we've built, it's better than anything I could have imagined back when I was desperate and terrified." "Then I don't regret it either." Silas stretched his legs. "I needed a partner, Clara. Someone smart enough to help build something lasting. I got exactly that. The fact that you're building your own thing on the side just makes you better at it." "On the side?" Clara smiled at that description of work that was rapidly becoming her primary focus. But Silas was right. Running her own programs made her better at understanding his operation. Teaching management skills made her better at actually managing. Everything connected. 2 years after their marriage, the valley operations had doubled in size and profitability. Clara's education programs served 700 women across 12 cities. She'd published a manual on practical business skills for women that was being used by programs as far away as California and Texas. And she was in negotiations with the territorial government to create formal certification for business training. She was also receiving dinner invitations from society families who'd snubbed her after the incident with Evelyn Boone. Clara declined them all with polite notes. She had no interest in proving herself to people who judged her by table manners instead of accomplishments. The one exception was Margaret Harrison, who'd become something Clara hadn't expected, a friend. They met monthly when Clara was in Denver, discussing program development over dinner and discovering they had more in common than business interests. Margaret had also married for practical reasons. Her husband had needed capital. She'd needed independence from a controlling father. They'd built a partnership that looked unconventional from outside but worked perfectly for them. "You know what's funny?" Margaret said one evening over wine. "Society matrons like Evelyn spend their whole lives trying to marry wealth and position. You married it almost by accident and then built your own wealth and position anyway. It must drive her absolutely mad." "I try not to think about Evelyn." "You should, because she thinks about you." Margaret smiled. "I heard through the social circuit that she's been trying to damage your reputation for 2 years now. Unfortunately for her, it's hard to damage the reputation of someone who's genuinely accomplished. You keep doing things worth respect, and her petty gossip looks exactly like what it is." Clara had heard the gossip, of course, that she'd trapped Silas through calculated manipulation, that she was cold and unfeminine for preferring business to social obligations, that her education programs were unseemly because they taught women to compete with men. She didn't care. Let them talk. Her programs were working. Young women were gaining independence, and Clara herself had built something that would outlast any society matron's opinion. The letter arrived in April, 3 years after Clara had married Silas Boone in a dawn ceremony that seemed to have happened in another lifetime. It was from Victor Boone, the first communication she'd had from him since Silas had fired him from the Denver office. Clara opened it with caution, expecting vitriol or threats. Instead, it was an apology. "Mrs. Boone, I am writing to express regret for my conduct during our previous interactions. I allowed professional frustration to become personal animosity, and I treated you with disrespect that was both unwarranted and ungentlemanly. I have spent these years watching you build an impressive educational organization while also supporting Silas's timber operation. It has forced me to confront my own prejudices about women's capabilities in business matters. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about Silas's judgment, and I was wrong to allow my own ambitions to poison family relationships. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize my errors. Respectfully, Victor Boone." Clara read it twice, then showed it to Silas when they crossed paths in the valley that week. "What do you think?" she asked. He studied the letter. "I think Victor finally realized that bitter resentment wasn't getting him anywhere. Whether the apology is genuine or strategic, I'm not sure it matters. Do I respond? Do you want to?" Clara thought about the man who'd tried to destroy Silas's business reputation, who'd called her ignorant and unsuitable, who'd sneered at everything she was and everything she'd become. "I think I want to accept the apology and move on," she said finally. "Not because he deserves forgiveness, but because I don't want to carry grudges. They're heavy, and I have better things to carry." She wrote a brief response thanking him for the letter and wishing him well. That was all. No reconciliation, no renewed family connection, just acknowledgement and closure. Evelyn Boone never apologized, of course. Women like Evelyn didn't apologize. But Clara heard through Margaret that Evelyn had stopped actively spreading gossip about her. Whether that was because she'd lost interest or because Clara's success made the gossip obviously false, Clara didn't know or care. The letter from her father arrived in late summer, delivered posthumously through a lawyer who'd been holding it per Thomas Whitmore's instructions. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're dealing with all the practical matters that death requires. Knowing you, you're handling them efficiently and probably haven't let yourself really grieve yet. Let yourself grieve, honey. You've earned it. But I also want you to know something. The choice you made, marrying Silas Boone to save me and our land, that wasn't a sacrifice. It was an act of courage. You looked at impossible circumstances and found the one solution that could work, even though it meant marrying a stranger and leaving everything familiar. I know you worried I'd think less of you for making a practical choice instead of a romantic one. I don't. I never did. You used the intelligence and strength I tried to raise you with, and you built a life better than anything I could have given you. I got to spend my last years in my own home, with my debts cleared and my dignity intact, knowing my daughter was not just surviving, but thriving. That's a gift beyond price. Don't let anyone make you feel lesser for choosing survival over sentiment. You survived, and then you did more than survive. You built something that helps other women survive too. I'm proud of you, Clara, more proud than I have words to express. Your loving father, Thomas Whitmore. Clara read the letter alone in the lodge study and finally let herself cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd shed at the funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place she'd kept locked down for 3 years. She cried for her father, who died knowing she was safe. She cried for the scared girl she'd been, desperate and terrified and making the hardest choice of her life. She cried for everything she'd lost and everything she'd gained and the impossible distance between that dawn wedding and who she was now. When the storm finally passed, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the desk drawer with other important documents. Her father's last gift. Permission to stop feeling guilty for the choice that had saved them both. 5 years after their marriage, Clara and Silas stood on the lodge porch, watching the valley transform in the autumn light. The original buildings had been joined by new construction, a proper school building where advanced forestry training happened, expanded bunkhouses for the growing workforce, storage facilities for the equipment needed to run a modern timber operation. The lodge itself had been renovated and expanded, though Silas had insisted on maintaining its timber character. New wings added space without destroying the original structure's integrity. It was still a mountain lodge, but now it was a mountain mansion, the center of an operation that employed over 200 people and generated sustainable profits year after year. "Marcus wants to retire," Silas said, breaking the comfortable silence. Clara wasn't surprised. Marcus was 65 and had been talking about stepping back for months. "Does he have someone in mind to replace him?" "David Chen. Says he's ready." Clara thought about it. David had proven himself over 3 years of managing daily operations. He knew the business inside and out, had good judgment, and commanded respect from the workers. "I agree," she said. "David's ready. We should make it official." "We." Silas smiled slightly. "I like that you still say we, even though you're running a territorial education empire and barely involved in timber operations anymore." "This is still home," Clara said simply. "Your business is still partially my business. Even if my focus is elsewhere, we're still partners." They were partners in the truest sense now. Their marriage had evolved from a desperate arrangement into something neither of them had expected. Genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. They didn't love each other the way romance novels described love, but they trusted each other completely, supported each other's work unconditionally, and had built something together that neither could have built alone. "I got a letter from the territorial governor," Clara said. "He wants to discuss making the education programs officially state-sponsored. It would mean significant funding, but also government oversight. What do you think?" "I think it's a good opportunity if I can maintain control over curriculum and hiring. I won't compromise program quality for government money." "Then negotiate those terms." Silas said it with complete confidence in her ability to do exactly that. "You're good at getting what you want, Clara." She smiled. "I learned from you. That first negotiation in the sawmill, you taught me what partnership could look like. I offered you money for marriage. That's not exactly romantic negotiation." "No, but it was honest. You told me exactly what you needed and what you could offer. No games, no manipulation, just clear terms." Clara leaned against the porch railing. "That honesty gave me room to negotiate my own terms, to ask for financial independence and written agreements and partnership instead of ownership. You could have said no to all of it." "Why would I say no? Your terms made sense." "Most men wouldn't have seen it that way. Most men would have wanted a wife they could control." Clara looked at him. "You wanted a partner you could respect. That made all the difference." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the valley settle into evening. Smoke rose from chimneys. Workers headed toward the dining hall for supper. Somewhere in the training building, students were probably studying the accounting lessons Clara had developed. This place had become more than a timber operation. It was a community, a training ground, the heart of something larger than just business. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Silas asked. "When you proposed to me in the general store?" "Sometimes." Clara remembered her desperation, her terror, her absolute conviction that she had no other choice. "I was so scared. I thought I was selling myself for nothing to a man who might be cruel or dangerous. I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life. And now? Now I think I made the best decision I was capable of making with the information I had." Clara turned to face him. "I didn't marry you for love, Silas. I married you for survival. But somewhere along the way, I stopped just surviving and started building. And I couldn't have done that without you. You could have, Silas said quietly. You're the strongest person I know, Clara. You would have found another way. Maybe, but this way worked. She smiled. We worked. This strange, practical, unromantic partnership that everyone said was doomed. We made it work. We did. Silas offered his hand. Partners? Clara took it, feeling the same calloused warmth she'd felt that day in the sawmill when they'd shaken on their agreement. Partners. The territorial governor agreed to fund the education programs, with Clara maintaining full curriculum control. Over the next 2 years, she expanded into 15 cities, serving over 1,000 women. The programs were so successful that other territories started requesting her manual and training model. Clara hired and trained regional directors, creating a structure that could sustain itself without requiring her constant oversight. She was building an organization that would outlast her, that would keep helping women long after she was gone. The timber operation continued thriving under David Chen's management, with Silas focusing on sustainable practices and long-term planning. They pioneered techniques that other companies eventually copied, proving that environmental responsibility and profit weren't mutually exclusive. And the valley remained the center of it all, the place where Clara and Silas crossed paths between their separate journeys, where they made decisions together, where they'd built something neither had imagined that desperate February morning. 7 years after their marriage, Clara stood in the same Denver conference room where she'd faced down Victor Boone. But this time, she was there to present her education programs to a gathering of business leaders and government officials who wanted to replicate her model across the entire Western territories. She wore one of her own dresses now, professionally tailored, yes, but bought with money she'd earned herself. Her hair was styled simply, practically. She looked exactly like what she was, a businesswoman who'd built something from nothing and wasn't apologizing for it. The presentation went smoothly. She explained her curriculum, showed results, demonstrated sustainability. When she finished, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. An older businessman approached her afterward, someone she didn't recognize but who clearly knew her reputation. Mrs. Boone, he said, I wanted to tell you something. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have hired a woman for any business position. I thought they lacked the necessary judgment and strength. He paused. You've proven me absolutely wrong. What you've built is remarkable, and it's forced men like me to reconsider our assumptions. Clara could have been gracious, could have thanked him prettily for his evolved thinking. Instead, she said, Sir, I appreciate that you've reconsidered your assumptions, but I didn't build these programs to prove anything to men like you. I built them because women like I used to be needed help, and no one else was offering it. The man blinked, surprised. My success isn't about changing your mind, Claire continued calmly. It's about changing lives for women who don't have the luxury of waiting for men to decide they're worthy of opportunity. But I'm glad you've learned something anyway. She walked away before he could respond, and she could feel Margaret Harrison's approving smile from across the room. That evening, she and Silas had dinner at a restaurant that would have intimidated her 7 years ago. Now it was just a place with good food and quiet tables where they could talk. How was the presentation? Silas asked. Successful. They want to expand the programs into 5 more territories. Clara sipped her wine. And I told a businessman he was an idiot for thinking women couldn't handle business. In those exact words? More politely, but the sentiment was clear. Clara smiled. I'm done being grateful when men condescend to acknowledge my competence. I've earned respect. I'm not thanking anyone for finally noticing. Good. Silas raised his glass. To my wife, who has no patience left for fools. To my husband, who never treated me like one. Clara clinked her glass against his. Even when I was terrified and desperate and proposing marriage to a stranger. Especially then. Silas's expression was soft. That took more courage than anything else you've done, Clara. Everything else built on that first impossible choice. They ate in comfortable silence. 2 people who'd started as strangers with a business arrangement and become something neither had expected. Genuine partners who'd built separate empires while supporting each other completely. 10 years after their marriage, Clara received a letter that made her laugh and cry simultaneously. It was from Sarah, one of the first young women she'd trained in the valley. Sarah had gone on to become a bookkeeper for a railroad company, then a contract manager, and finally the first female regional operations director in the company's history. Dear Clara, I'm writing to tell you that I've been promoted to Regional Director of Operations for the entire Colorado division. I'll be managing 17 stations and a budget of over $500,000. When I first came to your training program, I was a frightened 18-year-old who'd never been allowed to touch money or make decisions. You taught me bookkeeping, yes. But more than that, you taught me I was capable of learning, capable of leadership, capable of more than anyone had ever told me I could be. I want you to know that I'm using your teaching methods with my own staff now, training women alongside men, giving them the same opportunities, judging them on competence rather than gender. And it's working. The women I've hired are some of the best employees in the division. You changed my life, Clara, and through me, you're changing other lives too. That's legacy. Thank you for seeing potential in a scared girl who didn't know she had any. With deep gratitude, Sarah Clara showed the letter to Silas that evening in the valley. 700 women trained, he said quietly. How many Sarahs do you think you've created? I don't know, dozens, maybe. Women who'll go on to train others, create opportunities, change expectations. Clara folded the letter carefully. That's what I wanted. Not just to help individuals, but to change systems. You've done that. Silas gestured at the valley around them. This place, too. It's not just a timber operation anymore. It's a proving ground for sustainable practices that other companies are copying. Between us, we've changed how timber operations work and how women access business education across the entire territory. Clara thought about that, about the desperate mountain girl who'd married for survival and the woman she'd become, about all the miles between then and now, all the battles fought and won, all the lives touched and changed. Do you think we've done enough? She asked. I don't think we're finished yet, Silas replied. But yes, we've done more than enough to matter. Winter returned to the valley, as it always did. But Clara no longer saw winter as something to fear. The lodge was warm and solid, built to last generations. The operation ran smoothly year-round. The training programs continued even when snow blocked the passes. She stood on the porch one December morning, watching fresh snow transform the valley into the same white world she'd ridden into 10 years ago. But everything else had changed. Her mother's cottage sat on the edge of the valley now. Thomas Whitmore had lived there for 2 years before his death, spending his final time in comfort and dignity. It housed visiting instructors now, women who came to learn Clara's teaching methods so they could replicate them in other territories. The training building was full of students, 30 young women learning skills that would give them independence. Marcus had finally retired and now spent his days carving wood and telling stories to anyone who'd listen. David Chen managed daily operations with the same careful efficiency Clara had once brought to the role. And somewhere out in the territory, hundreds of women were living different lives because Clara had survived long enough to help them. Silas joined her on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in hand. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the mountains catch light. No regrets? He asked finally. Clara thought about it honestly, about everything she'd sacrificed and everything she'd gained, about the romance she'd never had and the partnership she'd built instead, about the desperate choice that had led to unexpected triumph. No regrets, she said. This life, what we've built, it's better than anything I could have imagined that morning in the general store. Even though you married a poor cowboy for nothing? Silas's tone was teasing. Clara laughed. Especially because I married a poor cowboy for nothing. Turns out he was rich, and I was stubborn, and together we built something that mattered. She leaned against his shoulder, and they watched the valley wake up together, workers heading to the sawmill, students walking to class, smoke rising from chimneys across the community they'd created. The girl who'd counted fence posts in despair was gone, replaced by a woman who'd built an empire from survival skills and stubborn determination. The poor cowboy had revealed himself as a wealthy timber baron with vision to match his resources. And together, they'd created something neither could have built alone. No secrets left to uncover, no battles left to fight, no unfinished business haunting their partnership. Just 2 people who'd started with nothing but practical need and built a legacy that would outlast them both. Clara Boone stood at the center of the life she'd claimed completely, and she smiled. She hadn't married wealth, she'd married opportunity. And she'd seized it with both hands and never let go.